The last woman to vanish, Rebecca Wright, had been seen talking to a man outside her apartment the night she disappeared. A man described as tall, disheveled, with a strange, unnatural smile. The police had initially interviewed a few witnesses, but no one could say for certain who the man was. The article ended there. Clara sat frozen in her chair, her mind reeling. The smiling man wasn't just a random figure. He was part of a pattern, a presence that seemed tied to the disappearances. He wasn't just haunting the neighborhood. He was the key to understanding what had happened to those people. But why was he targeting her now? That evening, Clara couldn't sleep. The images from the newspaper kept playing in her mind. Rebecca Wright's smiling face, the blurry figure of the man. The connection was too strong to ignore. She knew now that the smiling man wasn't just an apparition. He was something real. And the deeper Clara looked into the history of Elmwood Lane, the more she felt like a thread was unspooling, and she was caught in it. But what had started as a search for answers soon became something more sinister. Every day, the man seemed to appear in places she never expected. At work, he was in the background of her vision, an unremarkable figure, standing just outside her line of sight. On her walk home, he would be lurking in the shadows of alleyways, always watching, never moving. It was as if the world was closing in on her, and the smiling man was everywhere. No one else seemed to see him, but Clara knew he was there. She had to act before she lost her mind. Clara spent the next few days retracing the steps of the victims, interviewing old neighbors, searching for people who might have known anything about Rebecca Wright or the others who had vanished. She spoke with elderly residents who remembered the strange events of the 80s, but no one could offer anything that connected the dots. That was until she spoke with Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who lived a few doors down from Clara. Mrs. Peterson had been living on Elmwood Lane for decades, and Clara thought maybe she knew something the others didn't. Mrs. Peterson was sitting on her porch when Clara approached, her eyes cloudy with age, but sharp in their memory. "I don't know if this will help, but I saw something strange the night Rebecca disappeared," Mrs. Peterson said, in a low, raspy voice. "I didn't tell anyone at the time, but I think you deserve to know." Clara leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "Tell me," she urged. "About a month before Rebecca went missing, I saw her talking to a man. I didn't know who he was, but there was something about him. He had a smile on his face the whole time, like he knew something she didn't. And the thing is, I didn't think much of it at the time. People talk to strangers all the time. But then, I started seeing him more and more." "Who was he?" Clara pressed. "Do you know where he went?" Mrs. Peterson's eyes flickered with a mixture of confusion and fear. "I didn't know his name, but I saw him a few more times after that night. He'd always be standing near the park, just watching. And then, after Rebecca vanished, he was gone. Never saw him again." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. The man had been watching them for longer than anyone realized. He hadn't just appeared after Rebecca's disappearance. He had been stalking her for weeks, maybe even longer. But the most disturbing thing Mrs. Peterson said next would change everything. "I've heard rumors," Mrs. Peterson continued, her voice trembling. "People say he's not alive, that he's some kind of spirit, a shadow, that he's been here for a long time, since the old days." Clara's investigation had finally led her to an unsettling truth. The smiling man wasn't human. Not entirely, anyway. The rumors Mrs. Peterson spoke of echoed in Clara's mind. He was a figure tied to the history of Elmwood Lane, something darker than just a man. He was a spirit, a manifestation of something that had plagued this neighborhood for decades. But if he was a spirit, why was he targeting Clara? What had she done to provoke him? That night, Clara stood in front of her apartment, the weight of everything she had uncovered pressing down on her shoulders. She could feel him, the smiling man. He was close. And then, as she stared into the night, she saw him again. There, at the end of the street. Clara wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She walked toward him, her feet heavy with each step. The closer she got, the more the world seemed to twist around her. The streetlights flickered, shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air grew cold. When she was close enough, the man finally spoke. "I knew you'd come," he whispered, his voice barely audible, like a breath on the wind. Clara's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready. "What do you want from me?" she demanded. The man's grin stretched even wider, if that was possible. "You know what I want." Clara's eyes narrowed. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." For the first time, the smile faltered. The man took a step back. Then, in a voice that shook the very air, he spoke the words that would change everything. "You're too late." Clara's pulse raced as the man's words echoed in her mind, the finality of his statement hanging in the air, like an insidious cloud. "You're too late." For the first time since this nightmare began, Clara felt a deep sense of foreboding. She had been so focused on surviving, on figuring out what the smiling man wanted, that she hadn't stopped to think about why he had followed her all this time. There had to be something more to his actions, something deeper than just stalking her. She took another step toward him, her breath shallow and her mind racing. This wasn't just about fear anymore. This was about survival. The man's smile stretched wider, grotesque and unfathomable. He stood motionless, his eyes glinting with a knowing intensity. His grin seemed to distort his face, making his features almost unrecognizable. His skin was pale, too pale, as though he were more shadow than flesh. "Who are you?" Clara demanded, her voice steady despite the storm of terror swirling inside her. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes flickered to the darkened street behind her, where shadows danced like rakes, and the air seemed to grow even colder. "You don't need to know who I am," he said finally, his voice low, almost too calm. "What matters is why I'm here." Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stay where she was. She had come this far. She had to know the truth. "Why are you doing this? Why me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to sound composed. The man's smile faltered for a split second before returning to its unsettling stretch. His eyes seemed to pierce through her, as though they could see into the very depths of her soul. "You were chosen," he replied, his words slicing through the silence with an eerie finality. "You are part of the pattern, just like the others before you. The ones who walked these streets before, the ones who vanished without a trace." Clara felt her legs weaken beneath her, the full weight of his words crashing over her. She had always thought that her connection to the man was a curse, a random act of fate. But now, it seemed like something much more deliberate, something that had been planned long ago. The disappearances, they weren't random, the man continued, his voice cold and detached. They were the start of something much bigger. And now, you're part of it, just as they were. Clara took a step back, shaking her head in disbelief. "Number, this can't be happening. I won't let you do this." "You have no choice," the man whispered, his voice like a cold wind that seemed to freeze her very soul. "You've already made your choice the moment you decided to stay here. the moment you began to look for answers. Clara's eyes darted around, desperate to find any escape, but she was trapped. The air felt thick with dread, as if the world itself was closing in around her. You were always meant to be the last piece, the smiling man continued, stepping closer, his movement eerily slow and deliberate. The final part of the cycle. Clara's mind spun as she pieced together the implications of his words. The last piece. That meant the other disappearances, the victims who had vanished before her, weren't just random. They were connected, and she was the final person to complete whatever twisted ritual had been unfolding over decades. Why? She choked out. Why did they disappear? Why me? The man's grin widened, impossibly wide, and for a brief moment Clara thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that wasn't human. The smile, he said simply. The smile is the key. Those who saw it were chosen. Those who didn't were lost to the darkness. Clara's stomach twisted. And what about me? What happens to me? The man leaned in, his breath cold against her ear. You will see what they saw. You will become one with the shadows. Without warning, the world around Clara seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the once familiar street blurred before her eyes. The buildings around her seemed to warp, elongating into unnatural shapes, casting long, grotesque shadows that moved like living things. The ground beneath her feet felt as though it were giving way, as if she were standing at the edge of a precipice. Clara screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the thick, suffocating silence. The smile on the man's face seemed to grow, an abyssal stretch that threatened to consume everything. I won't become one of you, Clara cried out, her voice breaking with fear. The man's smile flickered, the expression shifting into something darker, more sinister. He stepped closer to her, his presence oppressive, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. You already have, Clara. You just don't know it yet. Suddenly, everything went dark. When Clara awoke, she was no longer standing on the familiar streets of Elmwood Lane. Instead, she found herself in an abyss of pure darkness. The ground beneath her was solid, yet she could feel the weight of emptiness pressing in from every side. There were no lights, no sounds, just an overwhelming sense of isolation. For a moment, Clara thought she had gone blind, but then she realized the darkness wasn't something she could see through. It was all-encompassing, like the world itself had disappeared. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to move. Every step felt heavier than the last. She called out, but her voice was swallowed by the endless void. There was no response, no echo. Clara's mind raced. Was this a dream? Had the smiling man really done this to her? Was this the fate he had promised? She thought of the disappearances, the victims who had vanished into the nothingness. Was she now one of them? Was this the space they had been trapped in? Then, out of the corner of her eye, Clara saw a faint glimmer of light. It was small at first, but as she focused on it, the light grew brighter, pulling her in. She stumbled forward, desperate to reach it, to escape this suffocating darkness. As she moved closer, the light became more defined, and Clara saw what it was. It was a doorway. The door was old and wooden, the paint chipped and weathered. The light came from the crack between the door and the frame, casting a soft glow that illuminated the darkness around her. Clara reached for the door handle, trembling with fear and uncertainty. She didn't know what would be on the other side, but she knew she couldn't stay in this void any longer. She had to know the truth. With one final breath, Clara opened the door. As Clara stepped through the door, she was met with an overwhelming rush of memories, flashbacks, visions of every moment she had experienced in the past weeks. The smiling man's grin, the feeling of being watched, the terrifying encounters that had felt like nightmares. But now, everything clicked into place. She was back in Elmwood Lane, or rather, a distorted version of it. The houses around her were decayed and warped, their walls crumbling, their windows shattered. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the pavement. Everything felt familiar, yet deeply wrong. It was as though she had stepped into another reality, one twisted by the forces she had been investigating. And there, standing in front of her, was the smiling man. But now, something had changed. The man wasn't just smiling anymore. His expression had softened, as though he was finally revealing the true nature of the game he had been playing. "You came to find the truth," he said, his voice like a whisper in the wind. "And now you know it." Clara stood still, her heart heavy with the weight of the realization. She understood now. She understood why the man had followed her, why she had been chosen. It wasn't just fate. It was something far darker, a cycle that had been set in motion long before she ever arrived. "This is the final step," the man said, his grin widening. "You are the last one, the end of the line." Clara could feel the weight of his words sinking in. She was no longer just a victim of the smiling man. She had become part of something much bigger, a force that had been woven into the fabric of Elmwood Lane for decades, perhaps even centuries. And now, she was part of the darkness, part of the cycle, a cycle that could never be broken. As Clara's vision blurred, she realized the terrifying truth. The smiling man wasn't just stalking her. He was the manifestation of the darkness that had haunted Elmwood Lane for so long, and she had become a part of it. Clara's heart raced as the smiling man stood before her, the grotesque grin on his face never wavering. She was caught between disbelief and a horrible realization. The door she had just passed through was no longer visible. There was only the twisted version of Elmwood Lane that stretched out before her, the houses decaying and the streetlights flickering ominously. She tried to move, but her body felt heavy, as if the very air had thickened, making every step a monumental effort. The smiling man took a step closer, his presence like a suffocating fog. "You wanted answers," he said, his voice chillingly calm. "But now you understand. This is where it ends, and where it begins again." Clara's mind screamed for clarity, but the words didn't make sense. She had thought the truth would set her free, but instead, it had trapped her in a nightmare beyond anything she could have imagined. Every instinct told her to run, but something about the man's presence, his unsettling smile, kept her rooted to the spot. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking as she finally found the strength to speak. The man tilted his head, his smile widening further. "The cycle must be completed, and you, Clara, are the final piece. The last to fall. The last to fall." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she began to realize the horrifying depth of what he was saying. She wasn't just caught in a random encounter. This wasn't some random haunting. This was something much worse. The smiling man stepped closer, his grin widening impossibly, until it seemed to swallow his face. "You have seen the smile," he whispered. "That means you are marked. You are now part of the pattern, just as Rebecca was, just as the others were. There is no escaping it." Clara recoiled as a wave of dizziness swept over her. Memories, half-formed and fragmented, began to rush to the forefront of her mind. The disappearances, the chilling warnings, the way the man had been there all along. lurking in the background of her life like an unseen predator, waiting for its moment to strike. She remembered everything now, but it was too late. "You will understand soon," the man said softly, almost as if to himself. His eyes glinted with dark amusement. "You will become one with them." Clara shook her head violently, as if doing so could erase the truth that had now embedded itself into her mind. But it didn't. The reality was undeniable. She had become part of a twisted, horrifying ritual, and now there was no escaping it. Her fear wasn't just for herself, but for all the people who had vanished before her, people she had once thought were just victims in some tragic tale. They were all part of the same terrible cycle, and she was the last one to play her part. The man stepped forward again, and Clara's knees nearly buckled. What happens to me?" she managed to force out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing happens to you," the man replied, his tone almost sympathetic. "You will simply become like them, forgotten, lost in the darkness. Your soul will fade into the void, just as theirs did." Clara's vision blurred as she fought to comprehend what he was saying. The words felt like a crushing weight, suffocating her. She had spent days searching for answers, trying to make sense of the impossible. But now, in this moment, all her efforts seemed meaningless. There was no way to fight this. There was no way to escape. "You won't be the last, Clara," the man continued, his smile never faltering. "The pattern will continue, as it always has. And one day, someone else will come looking for answers, and they too will fall." With those final words, the man turned and began walking down the decaying street. Clara stood there, her heart hammering in her chest as the truth continued to sink in. As Clara stood frozen in place, the world around her began to warp even further. The once familiar neighborhood felt like a twisted version of itself. Houses decayed and broken, the streets full of shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. But what was most disturbing was the feeling that the world around her wasn't quite real. It was as though she were trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. Her legs trembled beneath her, and she stumbled toward the path the smiling man had taken. Her feet felt like they were moving through sand, heavy, slow, as if the very fabric of reality was crumbling around her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think clearly. The man had spoken the truth, hadn't he? She was part of the cycle now. She wasn't just another victim. She was the last one, the last to fall, the final link in the chain. The darkness would consume her, just as it had consumed all the others before her. As she walked further down the street, she caught a glimpse of something in the distance, an old rusted street sign that barely hung from its post. It read, "Elmwood Lane." She was trapped in this endless loop of horror with no way out. Her thoughts spiraled in desperation, but then something caught her attention, a movement at the corner of her eye, a figure, tall and looming. Clara's breath hitched as the figure stepped into view. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the silhouette. The smiling man, his grotesque grin stretched wide across his face. But something was wrong. He was no longer walking toward her. He was disappearing. Clara blinked. She rubbed her eyes in disbelief. The figure was vanishing, fading into the darkness, as if he had never been there in the first place. And then, everything went silent. The street was empty. The neighborhood, decayed and broken, seemed to stand still, frozen in time. Clara's mind raced, her body trembling. What was happening? Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet began to shake. The air around her grew colder, heavier, suffocating. She tried to move, but her legs felt like they were encased in stone. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, slow and deliberate. And then, she saw them. Figures, shadows, emerged from the darkened doorways of the decaying houses, slowly at first, then faster. They were the others, the victims, people she had never known, their faces twisted in the same eerie, vacant expressions. They were all there, walking toward her, each with the same terrifying grin etched across their faces. The truth hit her like a physical blow. The people who had vanished, the ones who had disappeared, they weren't gone. They had become part of this twisted, endless cycle. And now, Clara was one of them. As the figures surrounded her, their eyes empty, their grins stretching unnaturally wide, Clara realized that she had truly become part of Elmwood Lane's dark history. She was no longer a person. She was a shadow, a ghost, a part of the cycle, the last piece. And in that moment, as the cold darkness enveloped her and the whispers of the lost souls filled her ears, Clara understood the terrible truth. There was no escape. There never had been. The world was silent again. Clara's consciousness flickered, the edges of her thoughts fading in and out of existence. She was aware of her body, but it felt distant, like it wasn't truly hers anymore. Her vision, too, felt blurry, disjointed. There were flashes of images, the twisted, decaying houses of Elmwood Lane, the smiling man's endless grin, the souls of the lost who wandered the street like phantoms. But none of it felt real, and yet it was all too real. As Clara drifted in and out of her fading consciousness, she felt a tug, a pull, toward something. Her mind couldn't grasp it, but there was a flicker of recognition, something familiar, something human. The door, the light. The darkness was closing in, but there was one final chance, one last hope. She reached for it, grasping at the fading light, trying to hold on to the remnants of her humanity. She wasn't sure if it would work. She wasn't sure if she was even capable of escaping. But as the dark figures encircled her, their twisted grins like a chorus of madness, she realized the truth. There was no escape from Elmwood Lane. There was no escape from the cycle. And as the darkness consumed her once and for all, Clara's final thoughts echoed in the emptiness. The cycle will never end. The next morning, a new face appeared on Elmwood Lane. A young woman, walking home from work, turned the corner just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. She felt a strange sensation in the air, like a warning, a sense of something wrong. But she ignored it, just as Clara had all those days ago. As she walked, a figure appeared in the distance, standing motionless with an unnerving grin on his face. And so, the cycle continued. Clara's mind swirled in the inescapable darkness, but something was different now. Though the endless cycle seemed to grip her, a faint ember of resistance sparked deep within her. She had been consumed by this shadowy world, but there was still a fragment of her human will, a faint glimmer of defiance that refused to be extinguished. The air around her seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, vibrating with an unseen force. For a moment, the faces of the other lost souls faded into the blackness, and Clara felt a strange sense of calm. The footsteps, the voices, everything had quieted down. Clara. A whisper came from somewhere deep within the darkness. Her name. It was soft, familiar, but distant. She opened her eyes, though the world around her was still dark. Her hands reached forward, uncertain of what she was grasping for. Was it possible? Could she still escape? The whisper came again. "You are not alone." Clara blinked, the words washing over her like a beacon of light in the suffocating blackness. Who was calling to her? Could it be that there was someone or something out there that could help her? And then, from the abyss, a shape began to form. Not a person, but a light. It flickered, dim at first, then grew brighter. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Her body trembled, but it was no longer out of fear. It was out of hope. The light began to take shape. A figure. No, several figures, all of them familiar. She saw faces, faces of people she had never met, but somehow they felt connected to her. Their expressions were not grotesque, like those of the lost souls wandering Elmwood Lane, but calm, serene, and almost pleading. One of the figures stepped forward, a woman with dark eyes and a sad smile. Clara's breath caught. She recognized her. It was Rebecca, the first of the missing who had been swallowed by the darkness before her, the one whose disappearance had set Clara on this harrowing journey. Rebecca stood in front of her, but there was no longer a vacant look in her eyes. Instead, there was a flicker of awareness. "Clara," Rebecca whispered, her voice soft but clear. "You have to remember. You have to break the cycle." Clara's heart raced again, but this time with determination. How? How can I break it? I've seen what happens to us. We fade into nothingness. We are lost forever. Rebecca shook her head slowly. "It's not over yet. You haven't given up completely, have you?" Clara struggled to comprehend what she was hearing. "But I'm part of it now, Rebecca. I am the last piece, the final link in a chain that goes on and on. There's no escaping." The others who had gathered around Rebecca stepped closer. They were people like Rebecca, lost but not gone. They were the ones who had vanished into the night, who had been absorbed into the cycle before her. Each one of them bore that same unsettling grin, but now it was softened, fading, like the shadow of their former selves. "No," another voice echoed, a man who looked just as lost as the others, his eyes haunted, but clear. "The cycle doesn't end by being swallowed into it. It ends by breaking it. There's always a way out, but you have to choose it." Clara's chest tightened. But how? How do I choose something that seems impossible? How do I fight something that controls everything here? Something that makes the world bend to its will? Rebecca smiled, her expression one of both sadness and hope. "You fight it by remembering. The man, the smile, it thrives on fear, on the darkness in your heart. You must remember the truth, Clara, before it all began, before you came to Elmwood Lane. You must remember who you were before the man's smile ever touched you." Clara's mind reeled, but she closed her eyes, focusing on the feeling that had begun to stir within her. A memory, a distant one, but one that felt real, like the first hint of daylight after a long, endless night. She was at her childhood home, standing in front of her mother. The sun was setting outside, casting a golden hue over everything. Her mother's warm voice, soft and kind, echoed in Clara's memory. "You have the power to fight back against the dark, my love. The light inside you is stronger than you think. Always remember that." A flood of memories rushed back. Childhood, laughter, love, and warmth. The dark man's smile had overshadowed so much of her life, but now she realized that he thrived on fear, on the erasure of everything pure and good. He thrived on the idea that people like her would forget the light they carried within themselves. Clara's hands trembled as she reached out to the flickering light before her, the one that had brought Rebecca and the others to her side. They had been trapped too, but they had found the strength to resist, to reclaim the memory of who they were. With a fierce cry, Clara gripped the light, pulling it toward her heart, where she felt a warmth surge through her body. It was the first time in weeks, maybe even months, that she had felt something other than fear. And with that warmth, she could feel it. The smile. The man's smile, the one that had been burned into her mind, began to fade. It wasn't gone yet, but its grip was loosening. The cycle that had been so tight around her was beginning to unravel. "You can do this," Rebecca's voice came again, clear and full of strength. "Remember who you are, Clara. Remember the light that lives inside you." Clara's mind surged with the truth she had so desperately forgotten. She was not just a victim. She was not just a part of the cycle. She was a person, a human being with power, with light, with strength. The smiling man could not take that away from her. With every ounce of will she had left, Clara released the fear that had been controlling her, every shadow in her mind evaporating like fog before the sun. She remembered herself. She remembered her family. She remembered what it meant to live. The darkness around her trembled. Clara stood tall, her body trembling but unwavering. "I will not become one of you. I will not let this cycle continue." And with that declaration, the darkness fractured. The world around Clara began to change. The figures that had once surrounded her, the lost souls, the tormented, the ones who had vanished into the smile, began to dissipate. They were not gone completely, but they were released. The man's grip on them was breaking, their dark forms fading like smoke in the wind. The smiling man himself stood before Clara, his grin wide and maddening. But now, it was no longer the terrifying force it once had been. It was a hollow, empty expression. His power, the power that had controlled Elmwood Lane for so long, was crumbling. "You cannot escape," the man hissed, his voice filled with desperation. Clara met his gaze, her resolve unshakable. "I already have." And in that moment, the darkness shattered. The twisted world of Elmwood Lane cracked and splintered, the oppressive fog lifting as Clara stood in the center of it all. The man's smile vanished, his form disintegrating into nothingness. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara felt the warmth of sunlight on her skin. The decaying houses were gone. The streetlights flickered one final time before fading out. The terror, the madness, it was all over. But it wasn't just over for Clara. It was over for all the others who had come before her. They were free. The smile was gone. Clara awoke in her own bed, the sun streaming through the window, casting light on the room that felt so ordinary, so real. It was as if the nightmare had never happened. She sat up slowly, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. She looked around, everything so familiar, so peaceful. Elmwood Lane, the smiling man, the lost souls, they were gone. Clara knew now that the darkness could never fully take her. She had faced it, and she had won. And as she stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air of a new day, she felt the weight of her past finally lifting. The cycle had been broken, and for the first time, she truly believed that the light, her light, would never fade again. Days passed since Clara's confrontation with the smiling man, and yet, despite the peace that had settled over her life, there was a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. The feeling of being observed, of an unseen presence lingering in the corners of her vision, was ever present. She had returned to her apartment, resumed her routine, but it wasn't the same. The memories of what she had gone through, of Elmwood Lane, the twisted cycle, the man with the grin, haunted her like a whisper in the back of her mind. Every corner she turned, every quiet moment she spent alone, she could feel the darkness trying to claw its way back into her life. There was a part of Clara that wondered if the cycle truly had been broken, if she had really escaped. Or was this just another form of the same nightmare, lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to lower her guard? One evening, as Clara sat on her balcony, staring out at the city skyline, she felt the familiar chill of unease crawl up her spine. She had learned to ignore it for the most part, but it was always there, just beneath the surface. Her phone buzzed on the table next to her, a notification from the news, something about a missing person report. Clara didn't need to look at it to know what the headline would say. It was always the same: a new disappearance, another person lost without a trace, just like Rebecca, just like the others. The missing were always part of the pattern, part of the cycle that had nearly claimed her. Clara's fingers hovered over the screen, but she hesitated. What if this was the beginning again? What if another person was being swallowed by the smiling man? Number. She had fought too hard to let the darkness return. She couldn't let it. Clara closed the app and stood up, pacing back and forth. The air was heavy, thick with tension. She had fought the man before. She had confronted the darkness head-on and survived. But now, she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to face it again. She wasn't sure if there was anything left to fight for. The thought that maybe the smile would find someone else, someone who hadn't been warned, made her chest tighten. She couldn't let that happen. But what could she do? The memories were fading. She had no proof, no evidence, just a gut feeling that the nightmare wasn't really over. She glanced at her reflection in the glass of the balcony door, the faint outline of her face barely visible in the twilight. Clara's features had changed since her experience. Her eyes were sharper, more alert. There was a weariness to her expression now, a knowledge of something she had never wanted to understand. She had seen things that no one should ever see. Suddenly, she heard a sound behind her. Soft footsteps. Clara whipped around, her heart racing, but there was no one there. She stood frozen, her pulse quickening. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the shadows, was stronger than ever. The wind shifted, and the air grew colder, heavier. It was then that Clara saw it. At the far end of the street below, just visible in the faint light of a street lamp, was a figure. Tall, motionless, and eerily still. The figure turned, and Clara's breath hitched. The same grin, the same unsettling smile. Clara's mind raced as she looked at the man. He was impossibly distant, but she could see the unmistakable curve of his lips, the hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her very soul. The same smile that had once haunted her every step. It couldn't be. Not now. But there he was. Number this time. She wasn't going to let him win. Clara turned back to her apartment, grabbed her keys, and rushed out the door. Her legs moved without thinking, faster than she had ever moved before, as if some primal instinct had taken over her body. She had fought the darkness once, and she would do it again. The smile wasn't going to take her again. She sprinted down the stairs of her building, each step feeling like it carried her further away from her former life, closer to the nightmare that had become her reality. She had to confront this once and for all. There was no running away anymore. The street was eerily quiet when she reached it, the only sound being the rhythmic beat of her own heart. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she walked toward the end of the road. She could feel him still watching her. The smile. It was getting closer. The streetlights flickered as she approached the spot where the figure had stood. The man's silhouette was gone. She stopped, her chest heaving as she scanned the street, searching for any sign of movement. It was quiet now. Too quiet. Clara's eyes narrowed, her senses on high alert. She knew the man wasn't gone. He never truly disappeared. A cold wind blew through the trees, the leaves rustling in an unnatural rhythm. That's when she saw it, a flash of movement from the corner of her eye. There he was, standing in the shadows of a nearby alley. His grin stretched wide, a grotesque smile that still sent a shiver down her spine. But this time, it was different. This time, Clara was no longer afraid. She had learned to fight this nightmare. She had learned that it was all a lie, a trick of the mind, a manipulation of fear. The man stepped forward, his hands slowly raising in mock greeting, the smile never fading from his lips. Clara took a deep breath. The darkness had no hold over her anymore. She had broken free from it once before, and she would do it again. The wind howled, and for a moment, everything seemed to go still. The street, the world, the very air itself. It was as if time itself held its breath. Clara stepped forward, eyes locked on the man. She felt her body vibrating with power, with defiance. This was her fight, her choice, and this time, she was going to win. "Do you think you can break me again?" Clara asked, her voice steady but filled with a fierce determination. "I know what you are. You are nothing, just a manifestation of fear." The man's grin faltered for the first time. His eyes narrowed in confusion. "You can't control me anymore," Clara continued, her voice growing louder. "You can't control anyone. You don't have power over those who refuse to be afraid." For a long moment, the man said nothing. Then, slowly, his smile began to fade, his form beginning to flicker, like a dying light bulb struggling to stay lit. Clara stood tall, her fists clenched at her sides. The night was hers, and with one final step forward, she faced the man, without fear. "You are over," she said, her words slicing through the silence. With a final deafening crack, the man's form shattered, his grin disappearing as he dissolved into nothingness. The street was silent again. Clara stood alone in the empty street, the last remnants of the nightmare vanishing with the wind. The coldness left, and the warmth of the sun began to return, casting light on the road that had once been her prison. For the first time in what felt like forever, Clara smiled. She had broken the cycle, once and for all. The world felt different after that night. Clara could finally breathe without the weight of fear pressing down on her. She had taken back her life, not just for herself, but for all those who had come before her. She could now live free, unburdened by the specter of the smiling man. And yet, as she walked through the streets, free from the nightmare that had haunted her, she knew one thing for certain: the darkness would always try to return. But now, Clara understood something she hadn't before. She was not just a victim, she was a survivor, and she would never stop fighting to protect herself and others from the terror of Elmwood Lane. And the cycle? It was broken. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the dispatcher's headset, the steady clack of keys as Rachel Hayes typed in response to an ongoing call. Her fingers moved with practiced precision, her mind balancing the weight of each emergency with the professionalism she'd honed over the years. It was the early hours of the morning, just after midnight, and the usual flow of calls had slowed. The police and fire departments had already wrapped up their final reports for the evening, leaving the dispatch center in a temporary lull. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her eyes flicking to the clock on the wall. She was still wide awake, but her mind was starting to wander. Then the phone rang. Her heart skipped. It was unusual for a call to come in this late unless it was an emergency, but she answered it anyway, accustomed to the unpredictable nature of her job. 911, what's your emergency? Rachel said, her voice calm and professional. There was silence on the other end. A faint, almost imperceptible static buzzed through her earpiece. "Hello?" Rachel repeated. "Is someone there?" A deep, labored breath came through the line, followed by a voice, thin, crackling, and filled with a strange urgency. "Help. Me." The voice was barely audible, a whisper caught between static and the sound of something else, something that couldn't be placed. Rachel's eyebrows furrowed. "What is your emergency? Where are you calling from?" She quickly checked the incoming caller ID. It was a blocked number, which was odd. Most callers she dealt with were identifiable, even if they were using public payphones or unlisted numbers. The voice on the line began to repeat the words, slightly louder each time, as though it were fighting to be heard through the interference. "Help. Me. Please." Rachel frowned. This wasn't a typical distress call. She checked the system for any matching addresses, but nothing appeared. It was as though the call wasn't coming from a real place. "Ma'am, I need you to tell me your location. If you're in danger, I can send help right now." Another breath. This time, it felt wrong, like someone was trying to force air through a clogged pipe, struggling and gasping. "The house. I'm in the house." Before Rachel could respond, the line cut out with a sharp crackle. She stared at the blinking screen in front of her, heart racing. For a moment, she considered calling back, but the number was blocked. She would have to trace it manually, and that would take time. With the late hour, it could be too late to help, but the message haunted her. Something about the call felt off, almost like it was too intentional, like it was meant to get her attention. Rachel tried to shake it off. It was probably a prank, a glitch, or maybe someone messing around late at night. That's what she told herself anyway. But when she closed her eyes for a moment, she saw it. The image of an old, dilapidated house. The kind you'd find in the woods, forgotten by time. It wasn't the first time Rachel had heard something strange on the line. Over her years as a dispatcher, she'd encountered all kinds of oddities, from glitchy calls to pranksters seeking attention. Still, this one felt different. The urgency in that voice, the way the words trembled, it was unsettling. Shaking her head, Rachel returned her attention to the incoming cue. But as she did, something gnawed at the back of her mind. The house. In the days that followed, Rachel couldn't shake the eerie feeling from the call. She had dismissed it at first, assuming it was a random mistake or an odd malfunction. But then, 2 more calls came in, each more bizarre than the last. The first call was almost identical, only the voice sounded even weaker, the static growing louder. The second call had the same frantic tone, but this time, Rachel swore she heard something more in the background, an indistinct, almost distant scream. Her colleagues noticed the strain in her voice when she answered the calls. Rachel prided herself on her composure, but these calls were starting to unravel her. She took it upon herself to investigate. The first thing she did was run a search for any mention of a house or location that might match the details. The words, "the house," stood out in the caller's frantic message. Was it just a metaphor? Was it real? The second call had come from a blocked number again, but Rachel knew she couldn't ignore it. She decided to track down where these calls were originating. What she found didn't make sense. The house, a former home, the Thompson family house. A tragic fire had occurred there years ago. 3 members of the Thompson family had perished in what the authorities had called an accident. The case had been closed, ruled as a result of faulty wiring in the house. There was no mention of anyone living in the house for years, no traces of new residents after the fire. But the name, Thompson, that was the same last name the caller had used. Rachel felt a chill, as she dug deeper, sifting through old news articles, trying to piece together a connection. The Thompson family had been local, and the house where they died had been abandoned ever since. A creeping thought started to form in her mind. Could it be that the house was calling for help? Or was there someone, or something, trying to reach her? Rachel's obsession with the calls deepened as she spent long nights tracking the history of the house and the Thompsons. The more she uncovered, the more unsettling things became. She found old police reports that mentioned a series of unsolved disappearances in the area around the same time as the fire, some even linked to the family. But none of this had been widely known or discussed, and the official investigation had brushed it aside as coincidence. Rachel's gut told her something was wrong. This wasn't just a simple house fire. Then, one evening, while looking through the case files, she received another call. "Help me, please. I'm still here." The voice, faint but unmistakable, chilled her to the bone. The house was still calling. This time, there were no static interruptions. The line was clear. The voice was getting stronger, and it was pleading for help in a way that shook Rachel to her core. "I'm still here. You need to find us." Rachel's hand trembled as she typed out the address of the abandoned house. She needed answers. She had to know what happened there. But the closer she got to the truth, the more paranoid she became. Something was watching her. Something was toying with her sanity. The night had fallen heavy and thick, the air cold enough to prick at the skin. Rachel sat at her desk, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, the hum of the dispatcher's room echoing around her. The office was empty save for her and the dim, flickering computer screens. She hadn't slept in 2 days. The calls, each more cryptic and terrifying than the last, had consumed her every thought. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, the words on the screen blurry as her exhaustion crept in. She had spent hours scouring the internet for any detail, any tiny clue that might explain what was happening. The Thompson family fire, the house that had once been their home. But now, it felt like something far darker was hidden beneath it all. The calls continued, always the same voice, always desperate. "I'm still here. It's not over. You have to find the others." The urgency had escalated with each passing night, and Rachel could feel it tugging at the very edge of her mind. It wasn't just a call anymore. It was a cry for help. She sat back, rubbing her eyes. Her hand reached for the desk drawer and pulled out the files she'd compiled. Photographs of the house, police reports, the old fire investigation documents. Rachel knew she was running out of time. The longer she let it fester, the more dangerous this was becoming. The calls weren't just technical glitches. The house was calling. Her computer pinged with an email notification. It was from an unknown address, a strange string of characters, but the subject line made her blood run cold. "The truth you're seeking." A chill ran down her spine. Hesitating for only a moment, she clicked open the email. It was nothing but a single line of text, the kind that made her hands shake as she read it. "They're still in the walls." Rachel's breath caught. She clicked on the attached file, a grainy black and white photo of the Thompson house, taken from an angle that she didn't recognize. It looked older than the photographs she had already seen, the front porch decayed and the roof caving in. But what was truly horrifying was what she could see at the top of the stairs, in the window. 2 figures, faint, indistinct shapes, peering out from the darkness, watching. "They're still in the walls." Rachel slammed the laptop shut, heart racing. She could hear the pounding of her own pulse in her ears. She needed to step away from this. This obsession was consuming her. It was unhealthy. It was driving her mad. But the house wouldn't let her go. She knew that now. The next morning, Rachel couldn't shake the haunting image from the photograph. The figures staring back at her. Was it real? Had someone else been in the house, lurking in the shadows all this time? That evening, when the call came again, Rachel was prepared for it. This time, she didn't hesitate. 911, what's your emergency? She said, her voice steadier than before, despite the fear gnawing at her insides. The static was deafening at first, but then the voice came through, clearer than ever. I'm still here. It's not too late. You can save us. The words were desperate, frantic, and though the voice still had that hollow, distorted edge, Rachel swore she heard something in it, a sound that she hadn't noticed before, a hint of recognition. Rachel leaned forward, focusing intently. Who are you? Where are you calling from? Her voice trembled despite herself. For the first time, the caller responded, I'm not dead yet. Rachel felt a cold sweat break across her forehead. Who is this? She asked, her hands gripping the edge of her desk. What happened to the Thompsons? There was a long pause, long enough to make her stomach twist in anxiety. The voice returned, softer, but still filled with that desperate plea. You don't know the whole story, Rachel. The fire wasn't an accident. We didn't die in the fire. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The words sliced through her mind like a sharp blade. We didn't die in the fire. What do you mean? She whispered, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting someone, or something, to be standing right behind her. We were trapped, the voice rasped, each word filled with pain. We're still trapped. Suddenly, a loud banging noise reverberated through the line. A crash, followed by muffled sounds, as if someone was trying to break through a wall, desperately scratching and clawing for escape. Rachel's heart hammered in her chest. Who is this? Where are you? Her voice cracked under the pressure. I'm in the walls, the voice whispered. I'm still here. Then the line went dead. Rachel stared at the phone in horror. She wasn't sure what she had just heard, but one thing was clear. The house had a dark secret, and it wasn't just the Thompsons who had suffered. Something else had happened, something far worse than a simple fire. The calls grew more frequent, the static was louder, the voice grew more persistent, and the warning from the last call. I'm still here. I'm in the walls. Rachel couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to go to the house. She had to know what was hidden inside, what the fire had concealed. But her instincts were telling her that going there might be the worst mistake of her life. Her dreams had become haunted by visions of the house. It was always the same. Smoke swirling, the sound of screams, the sensation of being trapped, the faintest whisper calling her name. Rachel, help me. It was as though the house was trying to pull her in, drag her to the dark heart of the mystery. And then, it happened again. Another call, but this time, Rachel wasn't prepared for what she heard. Rachel, I know you're listening, the voice said, so clear, so familiar, it nearly stopped her heart. You have to find me. You have to find the truth about the fire. It's waiting. Her hand trembled as she set the receiver down, sweat dripping from her forehead. The house had a will of its own, and it had chosen her. Rachel felt as if she was being drawn in, like a moth to the flame. The truth, distorted and terrifying, waited for Rachel as she entered the abandoned Thompson house, now nothing more than a crumbling shell of its former self. What she would uncover in the darkness would shatter her mind and change everything she thought she knew about the fire, about the calls. But there, in the silent dark, she would finally understand whether the house was alive or merely a vessel for something far more terrifying. The house stood before Rachel like a skeletal reminder of a past that refused to stay buried. The air felt thick, suffocating, as she stood at the foot of the overgrown path leading to the front door. The wood of the house creaked in the wind, the once pristine white paint chipped and peeling. Every step she took toward the house felt as though it was pulling her further into its darkness. The calls had driven her here, but now that she was standing before the crumbling ruin of the Thompson home, a sense of dread filled her chest. It was as if the house itself were waiting. Rachel had to find out the truth. She had to understand why it was calling to her, why the voice, so hauntingly familiar, seemed to be pulling her into its grasp. The front door was ajar, hanging crookedly on its hinges. A gust of wind pushed it open further, the faint scent of decay wafting out. Rachel hesitated for a moment, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but the voice from the calls echoed in her mind, urging her forward. "I'm still here." She stepped inside, the creaking floorboards protesting with every step. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of something unseen, as if the walls themselves were alive, watching her. Dust hung in the air like smoke, the rooms untouched by time, yet eerily still. The remnants of the past lay scattered around her. Broken furniture, yellowed newspapers, charred remnants of old family photos, and behind it all, the smell of something burned, something lost. Rachel's flashlight beam swept across the room. There, near the staircase, something caught her eye, a faint outline in the shadows. She approached it cautiously, the beam of her light shaking slightly in her grip. It was a wall, but unlike any wall she'd seen before. Faint discoloration ran along the edges, as if something had once been hidden there. Her breath caught. The walls. The voice had spoken about the walls. "I'm in the walls." Rachel reached forward, brushing her fingers along the wall. It felt cold, too cold for an abandoned house. A sudden gust of wind made her shiver, and she flinched. Something was wrong, but she couldn't turn back now. She pressed her palm against the wall, applying pressure, and then it moved. A hidden compartment. With trembling hands, she pulled on the loose panel, revealing a narrow, dark passage leading deep into the heart of the house. The air that poured out of it was musty, stale, and unmistakably old. It smelled of rot and something worse, something unnatural. Rachel hesitated, the voice echoing in her mind again. "Find the others. They're waiting." She couldn't ignore it. She couldn't leave. If she didn't uncover the truth now, it would haunt her forever. Swallowing her fear, she stepped into the passage. The passage was narrow, the walls pressing in around Rachel as she moved cautiously forward. Her flashlight flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. The air was oppressive, thick with an almost suffocating humidity. The deeper she went, the more disoriented she became. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, uneven and unstable, as though she were walking on the spine of something ancient. Then she saw it. At the end of the passage, a small door, barely noticeable, blending into the wall as if it had always been a part of the house. The faintest trickle of light seeped through the cracks around the edges. A room. A hidden room. Rachel's heart raced. She had found it. The place that had been concealed for so long. The place where the voice had been leading her. The door creaked open, revealing a chamber that looked as though it hadn't been touched in years, yet it felt wrong. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols that Rachel couldn't recognize. The air smelled metallic, like old blood. At the center of the room, there was something that made her blood run cold. A charred wooden box, half buried in the floorboards. She knelt down beside it, feeling a sudden surge of terror rise up from the pit of her stomach. The symbols on the walls began to pulse, faintly glowing in the dim light of her flashlight. Rachel's fingers trembled as she reached for the box. When she touched it, a sharp, almost electric shock ran through her arm, making her gasp. Something inside the box was alive. The box creaked open, revealing a tangle of blackened, decayed bones, human bones, and then a face that Rachel recognized. It was Thomas Thompson, the father. Her heart skipped a beat. The man who had died in the fire. His face was frozen in an expression of terror, burned beyond recognition, but unmistakable. His eyes were wide open, staring at her from within the wreckage of the box. Rachel recoiled, the flashlight slipping from her hand, clattering to the ground. She backed away, her breathing quick and shallow. No, this couldn't be happening. The walls around her seemed to shift, the symbols flickering like a heartbeat. And then the voice returned, louder now, filled with unmistakable anguish. "Help us, we never left." Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shook. A low rumble vibrated through the floor, and Rachel stumbled, falling against the wall. The house was alive. It was moving, shifting, as if reacting to her presence. The walls groaned and creaked, and then, just as quickly as it began, the rumbling stopped. Silence. Rachel's mind raced. The fire. It wasn't an accident. The fire had been a cover-up. The Thompsons hadn't died in the fire at all. They had been trapped, imprisoned in the walls of this house, left to die slowly, their bodies buried beneath the remains of the house they had once called home. But they hadn't died. Not all of them. They were still here. She glanced at the charred remains of Thomas Thompson in the box, her mind reeling. There were more. Others. The voice hadn't just been Thomas's. It had been all of them. The trapped souls of the Thompsons, reaching out for help, trying to warn her. As she scrambled to her feet, she heard a noise, a soft, wet squelching sound. She spun around to find the shadows deepening, and from the walls, figures began to emerge, pale, ghostly forms with burnt, hollow eyes. The Thompsons. And they were angry. The house seemed to breathe, its walls trembling as Rachel backed away from the apparitions of the Thompson family. The figures moved toward her, their burnt, tortured faces twisting in agony. Their eyes locked on her, pleading, accusing. "Why did you come here?" Thomas Thompson's voice echoed, his form the closest, his hands reaching out. "You should have left us to rest." The air grew colder, the room darker, and the walls seemed to constrict, narrowing in around her. Rachel's mind raced. She understood now. The house wasn't haunted by spirits. It had become something far worse. A prison. A slow, creeping realization took hold. The house had not just been a witness to the Thompsons' deaths. It had caused them. The fire was no accident. Someone had deliberately locked them in, sealing their fates in the walls. But Rachel had come too far. She couldn't go back now. She had to finish it. She had to free them. The spirits of the Thompsons surged forward, their faces twisted with a blend of pain and rage. The house groaned, its walls creaking as if protesting her interference. With trembling hands, Rachel grabbed the charred remains of the box and threw it into the center of the room. She whispered the words she had uncovered in the old journal she found in the attic, an incantation to release the trapped souls. And as the last word left her lips, the house screamed. The air in the room thickened with an oppressive weight. Rachel could feel the walls of the house closing in, the suffocating pressure pressing against her chest. as though the very house itself were alive, breathing, angry at her interference. The spirits of the Thompsons surged forward, their ghastly forms flickering in and out of existence, their eyes locked onto Rachel with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. As the incantation left her lips, the temperature in the room dropped so dramatically that Rachel's breath fogged in the air. Her heart thundered in her chest as she stumbled back from the spirits. The house groaned, a deep guttural sound that seemed to come from within its very bones, reverberating through the walls and floor beneath her feet. Then, with a deafening crack, the floor beneath her cracked open, the wooden beams splintering apart. A vast, dark chasm opened up in front of her, as if the house itself was tearing at the seams. The spirits of the Thompsons screamed in agony, their voices blending together in a cacophony of torment. "No, you cannot undo what has been done." Thomas Thompson's voice rang out, the distortion of his voice mingling with the others. His form loomed before Rachel, his face a twisted mask of rage and sorrow. His eyes, those hollow, burnt-out sockets, pierced through her. Rachel felt herself drawn toward him, her legs no longer obeying her. The house's malevolent grip on her was like a vice, pulling her closer to the abyss that had opened beneath her. They were trying to drag her in, but she fought back with every ounce of strength she had left. "No," she cried, stepping backward, forcing herself to break free from their hold. Her mind screamed, urging her to focus, to finish the incantation. She had to release them. She had to end this. With one final desperate cry, Rachel raised her hands, steadying herself. Her voice, shaking but resolute, rang out. "By the fire that consumed you, by the walls that kept you bound, I free you from your torment. I release you." The words reverberated through the room, vibrating in the very air around her. The house seemed to tremble violently, as though it were fighting against the power of her words. The spirits of the Thompsons screamed once more, their faces contorting in pain. But there was something else, something in their eyes that softened, as though they had finally heard her. Then, with a sound like the snapping of bones, the spirits suddenly stopped moving. Silence. Rachel's breath came in sharp gasps, her entire body trembling. She stood in the center of the room, the weight of the house's suffocating presence now gone. The oppressive feeling that had filled the space evaporated, leaving an eerie stillness behind. The air was lighter now, and yet it felt wrong. It was over. Rachel stood frozen in the dark, her body shaking uncontrollably. The spirits had disappeared. She could feel that much. The house no longer seemed to move, to breathe, to fight back. It was still. Dead still. The sense of dread that had filled her for so long slowly began to fade, but it left a hollow emptiness in its wake. The charred box still lay on the floor, its lid broken open, the remains of Thomas Thompson's charred body visible beneath the debris. His eyes stared at her, but there was no longer any malice in them, just silence. Rachel bent down, her legs weak, her mind hazy from exhaustion. She reached toward the box, her fingers brushing over the remains of the family. She could still feel a lingering presence, their spirits, now at peace. But as her hand hovered over the box, something caught her eye. The floor beneath it, it was still moving. A sudden sharp jolt surged through the room. The air turned cold again, and the very walls seemed to quiver in terror. Rachel's eyes snapped wide open, her heart pounding. She took a cautious step back, but her legs betrayed her, sending her stumbling to the ground. "No, no, this can't be happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's over. It's finished." But she was wrong. From the cracks in the floor, a new presence began to emerge. A figure, shrouded in shadow, rising from the depths of the house's very foundation. The air became thick with the stench of decay. Rachel's eyes widened in horror as the figure grew clearer, taking form before her. It wasn't one of the Thompsons. It was something far darker. A man, tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed an unnatural shade of red. His mouth twisted into a wicked grin, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. He was a shadow, a figure of nightmare, and as he stepped forward, the very room seemed to darken with his presence, the true source of the house's evil. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She knew instantly. This was the force behind the torment, the thing that had manipulated the Thompsons, that had kept them trapped in the walls. This wasn't just the spirit of a man. It was something far older, far more malevolent. It was an entity. Did you really think you could free them? The figure's voice rasped, echoing through the room like 1,000 whispers. You've only made it worse. They were my vessels, and now, you're mine. Rachel scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. The walls groaned as the entity's laughter echoed, filling her ears. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was something alive, something that had been feeding off the souls trapped within these walls for decades. She backed toward the door, her heart hammering. But as she turned to run, the walls seemed to close in on her, the very foundation of the house shaking beneath her feet. The house was alive, and now it was hungry. With nowhere to run, Rachel stood in the center of the room, the malevolent entity moving ever closer. Its red eyes bore into hers, its grin widening with every step. The house itself seemed to press in around her, its wooden beams creaking, the air thick with the scent of decay. But then, something flickered in Rachel's mind. The incantation. The power of the words had released the Thompsons, but she hadn't released the house itself. The entity, the source of its evil. Her eyes darted to the charred box, the remnants of the fire, the bones, the spirit of Thomas Thompson. They were the key. With trembling hands, Rachel grabbed the broken lid of the box, whispering the incantation once more. She didn't know if it would work, but it was her only chance. By the ashes that bind, by the soul that was torn, I release you. I banish you from this place. The entity let out a horrific screech, its form disintegrating into nothingness, its scream reverberating through the walls, shaking the very house to its core. The foundation groaned, the air thick with the sensation of something breaking apart. For a moment, everything stopped. And then, silence. Rachel stumbled outside, gasping for air. The sun had risen, casting light over the now silent house. It no longer felt alive, no longer pulsed with the evil that had taken root within it. The voices were gone. The house was still. She had done it. She had freed them. But at what cost? Rachel didn't know. She wasn't sure she ever would. The house, the calls, they had all led her here, to this moment. And in the end, she realized, the truth was never simple. It was something she would carry with her forever, a mystery that would never fully be understood. As she walked away from the Thompson house, the air felt lighter, but in the back of her mind, the questions lingered. Had the house truly been freed, or had it simply been waiting for the next victim? Weeks later, Rachel received another call. The voice on the other end was distorted, familiar. Rachel, it whispered, we're still here. And so, the cycle begins again. The night was unnervingly still as Mark drove along the desolate highway, his headlights slicing through the dense fog that had settled over the road. It was a quiet drive, too quiet. and the weight of the silence pressed on his chest like a vice. He hadn't planned to be here. In fact, he had no destination at all. The road stretched endlessly before him, the miles unrolling like an unwanted reminder of the years that had slipped away. A middle-aged man with a rough, worn face, Mark wasn't the type to make small talk, much less seek out company. He preferred the solitude of long drives, the hum of the tires on asphalt, and the gentle rhythm of the steering wheel beneath his hands. It allowed him to escape, even if only for a moment, from the haunting memories of his family's death, the guilt, the mistakes he couldn't take back. His life had been a series of missteps and regrets since that tragic day. But tonight, there was something different in the air, a strange stillness that seemed to pull at him, as though the road itself was calling him forward. The car's headlights flickered as a figure emerged from the fog. At first, Mark thought it was a mirage, just the fog playing tricks on his mind. But as he drew closer, the shape solidified into a young girl, standing at the side of the road, shivering in the cold night air. Mark slowed the car, his eyes narrowing as he assessed her. She looked no older than 14 or 15, her face pale under the dim glow of the headlights. She wore a thin white dress, bare feet against the cold pavement. She looked lost, her eyes wide with fear, her body stiff with the cold. Something about the girl stirred a strange feeling inside him, an unease that he couldn't place. But the longer he stared at her, the more he felt a pull, an instinct telling him to stop, to help. With a heavy sigh, Mark rolled down the window. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. The girl didn't respond immediately. Instead, she slowly turned toward him, her movements stiff, almost unnatural. Her eyes locked with his, and in that brief moment, Mark felt a chill ripple through him. There was something unsettling about her gaze, something that didn't quite fit. She spoke softly, her voice barely audible over the low hum of the engine. "I'm lost. Can you help me?" Her words seemed rehearsed, distant, as if she had said them before, many times. Without thinking, Mark opened the passenger door. "Get in. I'll take you somewhere safe." The girl nodded silently, stepping into the car with an eerie calmness. As she settled into the seat, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His heart pounded in his chest as he started to drive, the fog swallowing the road ahead. The drive felt unnaturally long, as if the minutes were stretching into hours. Mark glanced at the girl from time to time, noticing the way she stared out the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face was unreadable, but her presence was impossible to ignore. There was an unsettling air about her, an energy that didn't belong in the car. "So, where are you headed?" Mark asked, trying to break the silence, though he wasn't sure why he bothered. She hadn't spoken much so far. "I don't know," she replied, her voice distant, as though she wasn't entirely present. "I've been looking for something." Mark frowned. "Looking for something? What do you mean?" The girl turned her gaze toward him for the first time in what felt like ages. Her eyes were dark and hollow, and there was something unnervingly ancient in them. "A place," she whispered, almost as though she were talking to herself. "A place I've been before." Mark shivered despite the warmth of the car. Her words didn't make sense, but there was a coldness in her tone that made him question whether she was speaking of a literal place or something else entirely. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of the tires on the wet road and the occasional gust of wind outside. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, the girl's head tilted slightly as she peered out the window. Her eyes seemed to focus on something ahead, but Mark couldn't see anything through the thick fog. Her lips parted, and she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "It's close." Mark's skin prickled. He glanced at her, but she was staring intently out the window, her expression distant and blank. "What is?" he asked, his voice tight. But the girl said nothing more. Instead, her hands clenched and her body tensed as if bracing for something. Mark's heart began to race, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. And then, without warning, the girl vanished. One moment, she was sitting in the passenger seat beside him. The next, she was gone. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt as he frantically turned his head toward the empty seat beside him. She was gone. Completely gone. Mark's mind raced as he pulled over to the side of the road, the fog thickening around him, shrouding everything in an eerie stillness. He sat there for a long moment, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a hallucination? Had he imagined the girl entirely? But the strange coldness that lingered in the car was real, as was the sense of dread that weighed on his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that the girl hadn't been a figment of his imagination. She had been there. He had seen her. Confused and unsettled, Mark turned on the radio, hoping to distract himself. But as he flicked through the stations, one particular news story caught his attention. A tragic accident occurred on Route 17, just outside the town of Crestwood, 10 years ago tonight. A young girl, believed to be hitchhiking, was struck and killed by a hit-and-run driver. The incident remains unsolved, with authorities unable to identify the vehicle involved or the driver responsible. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The date, the time, it all lined up. The girl, the one he had picked up. Was it possible she was... The thought sent a chill down his spine. He had to know more. The girl had to be connected to this tragedy. There was no other explanation. The next morning, Mark drove into Crestwood, a small, sleepy town that had long since been left behind by progress. He visited the local police station, hoping to dig deeper into the unsolved case. The officers, though polite, seemed reluctant to talk. There was something in the air, an unspoken tension that Mark couldn't quite place. Eventually, after some persistence, he managed to get the name of the girl who had died that night: Emily Turner. A quick search revealed that Emily had been an orphan, a girl with no known relatives. A few scattered memories from locals painted a picture of a quiet, mysterious teenager who often disappeared for days, hitchhiking to who knew where. The more Mark dug, the more unsettling details emerged. Emily's death had been swept under the rug, the investigation quickly closing with no real leads. But there were whispers, a rumor that her death had been more than a random accident. As Mark uncovered more about the girl's life, the story began to unravel. Emily had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but her death wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up, a tragic end to a series of dark secrets in Crestwood that had been buried for far too long. The more Mark uncovered, the more he realized that Emily's death was only the beginning. As he pieced together the evidence, he found connections between her death and a group of influential townspeople, all of whom had something to hide. The truth was far darker than Mark could have ever imagined. One evening, as Mark stood on the same stretch of highway where he had picked up Emily, a cold wind swept through the trees. The fog rolled in thick and fast, obscuring everything beyond a few feet in front of him. Suddenly, Mark felt a presence. He turned, his breath freezing in his chest, and saw her standing there. The girl from the car, Emily, her ghostly form glowing faintly in the fog. She was no longer the lost, shivering girl. She was angry now, her face contorted with a mixture of sorrow and rage. "It wasn't an accident," she whispered, her voice echoing in Mark's mind. "They killed me, and they're still hiding the truth." The air grew heavy, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to tremble. Mark knew, without a doubt, that he had to uncover the full story. Only then could Emily rest in peace. Mark's investigation culminated in a harrowing confrontation with the town's dark past. In a final, terrifying moment of clarity, Mark uncovered the full extent of the cover-up. The people responsible for Emily's death had long since moved on, but they hadn't counted on one man, a broken, haunted man, seeking justice for a life lost too soon. In the dead of night, Mark returned to the stretch of road. Emily's spirit was waiting, her eyes filled with the longing for justice. Together, they confronted the truth. The past was brought to light, the guilty exposed, and Emily's restless soul finally freed from the shackles of her tragic fate. For Mark, it was a turning point. The ghosts of his own past had been exorcised, and though the memory of Emily and the dark road would stay with him forever, he felt a sense of peace for the first time in years. He had uncovered the truth, and the truth had changed him forever. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that his life had taken a dark turn, like he was caught in the grip of something far larger than himself. Each step he took into the depths of Crestwood's secrets felt like a descent into a deeper darkness, and he wasn't sure if he was doing this for Emily's sake or his own desperate need for redemption. After the confrontation with Emily's ghost, he found himself more obsessed than ever. The memories of that night, the look in her eyes, haunted him every waking moment. He couldn't forget the way she had appeared to him, so full of quiet fury and sorrow, and how her voice still echoed in his head, urging him to find the truth. But Mark's search wasn't going unnoticed. The townsfolk grew wary of his constant questioning, and as he dug deeper, he began to sense that someone, maybe more than one, was watching him. Sometimes, when he passed certain houses or bars, the curtains would twitch and eyes would flicker behind windows. He didn't need to be told that the people of Crestwood had more to hide than they let on. A sense of dread hung in the air, like a thick fog. The people of Crestwood were hiding something, and Mark was getting too close. The more he uncovered, the more he realized the truth was tied to the heart of the town itself, a web of secrets that ran much deeper than one forgotten death. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about the dark underbelly of the town, the violence and corruption that had been allowed to fester for far too long. One evening, after weeks of digging, Mark found an old, crumbling ledger hidden in the back of a dusty local archive. Its pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but legible enough to make out a few damning names. As he flipped through the pages, one entry stood out. The Turner Case, January 17, 2005. There, in black ink, was the mention of a town meeting, an odd reference to an unforeseen event, and several names Mark recognized immediately. Prominent figures in the town who had never been linked to the case, people who should have been questioned. But there was something even more disturbing. The entry mentioned the willful disposal of a body and family protection. Terms that screamed conspiracy. Mark's heart raced as he read the rest of the entry, his mind working frantically to connect the dots. This wasn't just about Emily's death. It was a cover-up of something much darker, and it involved people Mark had known his whole life. The more Mark uncovered, the more the town seemed to close in on him. People grew more hostile. Conversations halted when he entered a room, and the innkeeper refused to serve him a drink. when he tried to ask about a man named Robert Donovan, the town's mayor at the time of Emily's death. Donovan's name appeared in the ledger, along with others, names of families who had held power in Crestwood for generations. One night, Mark returned to the old highway, hoping the quiet and the cold might provide some clarity. It had been years since he had felt so lost, like he was drowning in a sea of half-truths and shadowed memories. But that night, as he stood alone on the side of the road, he felt the unmistakable presence of Emily again. "I can feel it too," a voice whispered behind him. Mark spun around, his pulse quickening. But there was no one there, nothing but the empty road and the fog, creeping in like a living thing. He was alone. Or was he? His mind raced. Was it Emily's spirit, still lingering, trying to guide him? Or was it something more? Something darker? Something that would keep him from ever uncovering the truth? Suddenly, the sound of tires screeching on the wet asphalt broke the silence. Mark turned to see a dark figure approaching in the distance. An SUV, its headlights cutting through the fog. It slowed as it reached him, coming to a stop with the engine running. The window rolled down, revealing the sharp, calculating gaze of Robert Donovan, the mayor who had been at the center of the cover-up all along. "You should stop digging, Mark," Donovan said, his voice smooth, almost soothing. "You don't want to get involved in things you don't understand." Mark's heart hammered in his chest. The mayor's tone was cold, too controlled, as though he knew something Mark didn't, something that made his warning all the more dangerous. "I've seen the ledger," Mark said, his voice steady, despite the pounding fear in his chest. "I know what happened to Emily. I know what you did." Donovan's lips curled into a thin smile. "You don't know anything, Mark. You only think you do." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping lower. "And you're not going to like what happens when you start asking the wrong questions." Before Mark could respond, Donovan rolled up the window and drove off, leaving Mark standing there, heart racing, his mind reeling from the threat. Mark couldn't let it go. Donovan's words, though chilling, only fueled his desire to uncover the truth. He knew that the mayor's warning wasn't just idle chatter. It was a veiled threat, a message that warned him of something far more sinister, waiting beneath the surface of Crestwood. That night, Mark revisited the places he had once frequented, the local taverns and diners where townsfolk whispered behind closed doors. This time, he found an ally, a man named Jack, a former police officer who had been dismissed from the force after the investigation into Emily's death had gone cold. Jack had his own reasons for wanting the truth to come out. He had been the one to first arrive at the scene of Emily's death all those years ago, and what he had seen had haunted him ever since. He confided in Mark that he'd been silenced, pressured to ignore the evidence that pointed to foul play. Emily hadn't been the first girl to disappear on that stretch of road, and Jack believed her death was part of a much larger pattern, one that involved a few of the town's wealthiest and most powerful families. Jack's words were chilling. "They're still covering it up, Mark. The people who killed Emily, they're still here, and they'll do whatever it takes to make sure no one finds out." Mark felt the weight of Jack's revelation sink in. It wasn't just about one tragedy. It was about a system, a network of corruption that had gone unchecked for years, and Emily was just a small piece of the puzzle. The final night arrived, the night Mark had feared, but also the one he had been waiting for. With Jack's help, he gathered the evidence he needed to expose the truth. But they knew it wouldn't be enough. The people responsible wouldn't go down easily, and Mark had already seen the lengths they were willing to go to protect their secrets. The two of them stood at the edge of the same highway, where Emily had died, the fog swirling around them like a living entity. Mark could feel the weight of the past bearing down on him, the tension thick in the air. Then, suddenly, Emily appeared. This time she was no longer a ghostly figure. Her presence was solid, her form clear and real, as though the very earth itself had given her the power to manifest fully. Her eyes met Mark's, filled with both sorrow and rage. "They'll never stop, Mark," she said, her voice low and haunting. "But you can make them." The sound of footsteps behind him broke the moment. Mark turned to see Donovan and several of his associates emerging from the fog, their eyes cold and unfeeling. "It's over, Mark," Donovan said. "You don't know what you're dealing with." But Mark wasn't afraid anymore. He had the truth, and he wasn't going to let these people get away with what they had done. Not this time. In a final desperate act of defiance, Mark exposed the evidence to the world. The truth about Emily's death and the dark secrets of Crestwood finally came to light. The next day, the world was different. The people who had hidden their sins for so long were no longer untouchable. The truth had shattered their lives, and Mark had finally done what he set out to do. He had helped Emily find peace. But for Mark, peace would always be fleeting. The haunting memories of that night, the girl who had vanished from his car, the spirits of the past that he could never forget, stayed with him, always. In the end, Mark found that the road to redemption wasn't a destination. It was a never-ending journey, and the past would always be a shadow, waiting to catch up. Claire Stanton had always prided herself on living a quiet, simple life. At 32 years old, she had settled into a routine that was, by all accounts, entirely ordinary. She worked as a librarian at a small local library, where her days were spent organizing books, cataloging new arrivals, and helping patrons find what they needed. Her evenings were reserved for solitude in her modest apartment. It was nothing fancy, just a small one-bedroom in a quiet building on the outskirts of town. But it was hers, and it provided her with the kind of peace she craved. That was, until something strange began to happen. It started innocently enough one late evening as she was getting ready for bed. Claire had just finished brushing her hair and was staring at herself in the bathroom mirror. As she set the brush down, she noticed that her reflection didn't match her movements. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but her reflection seemed to lag behind her by a fraction of a second. At first, Claire dismissed it. She attributed it to tiredness, the kind that comes from a long, monotonous day at work. "Just stress," she muttered to herself. It was probably nothing more than her mind playing tricks, she reasoned. But over the next few days, the discrepancy became more noticeable. Whenever she passed a reflective surface, whether it was a mirror, a window, or even the shiny surface of a toaster, her reflection would move just a beat too slowly. It was so subtle, so faint, that at first, Claire could convince herself it was an optical illusion. But the longer it persisted, the more unnerving it became. It wasn't just the reflections that bothered her. Claire began to notice strange noises in her apartment late at night, scratching sounds that seemed to come from behind the walls, whispers just at the edge of her hearing. She would sit up in bed, straining to listen, but there was never anything there when she checked. Her sleep grew more fitful, haunted by vivid, unsettling dreams of dark shadows that seemed to flicker just out of sight. In her waking moments, there was an ever-present sense of being watched. But the worst part, the one thing that truly began to unnerve her, was the increasing disconnection between herself and the reflection she saw in the glass. Every time she looked into a mirror, it seemed as though her reflection was not entirely her. It was as though it had a life of its own. It moved independently of her, as if mocking her every action. Claire tried to brush it off. She began to isolate herself more, refusing to meet friends for dinner or attend social events. She convinced herself that if she kept quiet, no one would notice the strange occurrences. But it was growing harder to ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One night, Claire stood in front of her bathroom mirror, her face pale in the dim light. She had been staring at her reflection for what felt like hours, transfixed by the strange movements of her own image. This time, the reflection didn't simply lag behind her. It seemed to act of its own accord. As Claire moved to brush her hair, the reflection stayed still, then jerked to life, as though it were imitating her actions with a delay. Her heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. For the first time, she could no longer dismiss it as a trick of the mind. The events of the next few days were a blur. Claire found herself slipping into a deep, paranoid state, overwhelmed by anxiety. The reflection, once just a slight inconvenience, now felt like a constant, unnerving presence in her life. No matter where she went, there it was, mocking her from the surfaces around her. At work, things were no better. Claire couldn't focus on her tasks anymore. She kept catching glimpses of herself in the glass windows of the library, watching as her reflection moved just out of sync with her own motions. At one point, she even swore her reflection winked at her. It was at this moment that she began to question her sanity. Was she losing her mind? Was this a psychological breakdown? She knew her mother had suffered from mental health issues, but Claire had never expected to be plagued by the same fate. Her mother had spent years in and out of therapy, her own reflection moving like a separate entity. She had been diagnosed with a rare neurological disorder, a condition that caused similar hallucinations. The thought terrified Claire. Was it possible that she too was succumbing to the same fate? Was this the beginning of her own decline? Late one night, after a particularly disturbing episode in front of the bathroom mirror, Claire's mind raced. She couldn't stand the idea of being trapped in her own body, haunted by a reflection that was slowly taking on a life of its own. It was then that the noises started. At first, they were faint, just a soft scraping sound that Claire couldn't quite place. But as the days went on, the sounds grew louder, scratching, tapping, shuffling. They seemed to come from the walls, from the spaces she couldn't see, and they were relentless. Claire spent nights pacing the apartment, unable to shake the feeling that something, or someone, was in the room with her. She could feel its presence, just out of reach, always watching. It was like a shadow, a cold breath against her skin. Claire became convinced that her reflection was no longer just a part of her. It was something else entirely, something malevolent. Her therapist, Dr. Marlowe, had been the only one she confided in, but after several sessions, Claire could tell that even Dr. Marlowe didn't know how to help her. "It sounds like you might be experiencing a psychotic break," Dr. Marlowe had said, his voice filled with concern. But even as he spoke, Claire could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't understand. One evening, Claire finally had enough. Desperate for answers, she called her ex-boyfriend, Nathan. Though they had broken up years ago, Nathan had always been protective of her. Claire needed someone who might believe her, someone who might help her escape the suffocating grip of her own reflection. When Nathan arrived at her apartment, his concern quickly turned to worry. He was visibly unsettled by the eerie silence of her place. "Claire, you look like you've seen a ghost. What the hell is going on?" he asked, glancing nervously at the windows. But as the night went on, the terror seemed to escalate. The reflection grew bolder, more insistent. It seemed to be watching them, waiting. Claire felt the walls closing in on her, and she fled the apartment, running down the street in a blind panic. Nathan tried to catch up, but she disappeared into the darkness, too consumed by fear to listen. The next morning, Claire's body was found in her bathroom. Detective Ryan Matthews arrived at the scene, his mind still clouded by the events of his own personal life. Matthews had seen his fair share of strange cases, but this one felt different. There were no signs of forced entry, no obvious wounds, but the scene was unsettling. Claire's body was sprawled on the floor, her eyes wide open, staring into the bathroom mirror. There were signs of a struggle, her clothes torn, her skin bruised, but nothing that could explain the cause of death. What was most disturbing was her reflection. It remained, unnervingly still, staring back at her from the mirror. There was something about it that seemed off, too deliberate. Matthews couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. Claire's apartment was untouched, no signs of theft, no forced entry. The only thing that seemed out of place was Claire's reflection, and that was something Matthews couldn't explain. As Matthews began his investigation, he uncovered troubling details about Claire's past. She had recently started therapy, trying to address unresolved trauma stemming from her childhood. Matthews learned that Claire's mother had suffered from a rare neurological disorder, one that caused her reflection to behave in the same strange way Claire had described. The possibility that Claire might have inherited the condition gnawed at Matthews. But there were other things to consider. Claire had an ex-boyfriend, Nathan, who had a violent history. Matthews spoke with Nathan, who was evasive and defensive, refusing to elaborate on the events leading up to Claire's death. What was the connection between Claire's strange death, her mother's condition, and Nathan's potential involvement? And more chillingly, what was the truth behind the reflection? Detective Ryan Matthews stood in Claire Stanton's apartment, taking in every detail. It was a modest space, nothing extravagant, but there was an odd sense of quiet. Too quiet. He had been to crime scenes before, but there was something in the air here that he couldn't quite place. It felt wrong, almost as though the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Matthews glanced at the bathroom mirror again, feeling a shiver run down his spine. Claire's body had been found there, eyes locked onto her own reflection. But the more he studied the mirror, the more he wondered if it was just another clue, a small, seemingly insignificant detail that might hold the key to everything. Something about the way her eyes had been staring, almost accusingly, unsettled him. He turned away from the mirror and walked toward the living room, where Claire's bookshelves were neatly organized. It was strange to think of her as a victim of something so strange. She had seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable in her daily routine. It didn't make sense. The lack of signs of forced entry, the absence of theft, nothing added up. Matthews sifted through her belongings, finding a few journal entries tucked into her desk drawer. They were filled with disjointed, fragmented thoughts, many of them referencing the disturbing reflections she had been experiencing. The entries were written in a way that suggested someone unraveling, someone desperate for answers. But the more Matthews read, the more a particular word jumped out at him. Reflection. It's like the reflection is alive. It's trying to take over, to replace me. It's watching me. It's becoming me. The entries grew increasingly paranoid. Claire spoke of feeling like an outsider in her own body, like her reflection was no longer her own. Matthews rubbed his forehead, wondering if this was a result of some deep psychological breakdown. Yet, a small voice inside him whispered, that there was something more here, something far darker than mere madness. Just then, the door to the apartment creaked open, and a tall man stepped inside. It was Nathan, Claire's ex-boyfriend. His posture was stiff, his eyes darting nervously as he surveyed the scene. He had been notified of Claire's death earlier that morning and had come to offer his statement. Matthews had already spoken to him on the phone, but he needed to get a better sense of the man. Nathan's expression flickered when he saw Matthews. His jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms over his chest defensively. Matthews noted the tension in his posture and the unease in his eyes. "You were close to Claire, weren't you?" Matthews asked, taking a step forward. Nathan hesitated, his eyes flicking to the bathroom. He swallowed hard, clearly struggling to keep his emotions in check. "Yeah, we had our problems, but I never wanted this." He seemed sincere, but Matthews had learned long ago to be cautious of first impressions. "Did you know about what she was going through?" Matthews asked, his voice measured. Nathan looked away, guilt flashing across his face. "She started seeing a therapist a few months ago. I don't know all the details. We weren't on good terms when she started therapy. But yeah, she was having problems with her reflection, some mental stuff." His voice faltered as he spoke, as though the words themselves were hard to believe. "Her reflection?" Matthews repeated, his interest piqued. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Nathan ran a hand through his hair. "She would talk about it. She said it was moving differently, that it wasn't syncing up with her, like it was its own thing. She said it started happening after her mom died." Matthews watched Nathan closely. "Her mother died of a neurological condition, right? Something that affected her perception?" Nathan nodded. "Yeah. It was a rare disease, but it wasn't just the disease. Claire told me her mom had..." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Had what?" Matthews pressed. "She had hallucinations. She thought her reflection was trying to take over, just like Claire said. At first, I thought it was just her anxiety. But then, after Claire started seeing the therapist, I wasn't so sure." Matthews leaned in. "You're saying Claire was seeing her reflection do the same thing her mother had experienced?" Nathan's expression darkened, his voice lowering. "Yeah. Claire believed her reflection was alive, and she thought it was trying to replace her. I didn't know what to do. She wasn't the same person when it started. I should have done more, but I didn't believe her. Not fully." Matthews nodded, taking note of everything Nathan said. "Was she ever violent, or did she ever try to hurt herself?" Nathan winced, his eyes distant. "There was one night after we broke up. I saw her, standing in front of the mirror, just staring at herself. She was crying. She didn't say anything, but I know she was scared. She didn't look like herself." Matthews felt a chill as he looked at Nathan. "What happened that night?" "I left," Nathan muttered, looking down at his shoes. "I couldn't deal with it anymore. She wasn't the woman I knew." Matthews wasn't so sure Nathan was being entirely truthful. There was more to the story, something Nathan wasn't saying. But Matthews didn't have time to dig further into Nathan's involvement just yet. He needed to follow the thread that Claire had left behind, the reflections. There was something far more sinister at play here, and Matthews was determined to get to the bottom of it. As the investigation continued, Matthews began to uncover more unsettling details. Claire's journal entries grew more erratic as time passed, each page filled with frantic writing, detailing her worsening obsession with the reflection. She spoke of it as if it were a living, breathing entity, something that wanted to take over her life. There was a common thread that Matthews couldn't ignore. Claire's mother had suffered from the same affliction, and now Claire was experiencing it too. The reflection wasn't simply a product of anxiety or mental illness. It was something far more dangerous. Matthews couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't just a coincidence. There was a connection between the mother's illness, Claire's growing paranoia, and her tragic death. He began to suspect that there was something genetic at play. But could that explain the strange behaviors Claire had described? Was there a scientific explanation? Or, as the more disturbing part of Matthew's mind whispered, was there something supernatural at work? The deeper Matthews dug, the more he found that Claire wasn't the only one to experience these strange reflections. Reports from various sources, scattered across the years, detailed similar accounts. People seeing their reflections act out of sync, behaving as though they had a mind of their own. Some of these people had been institutionalized, while others had simply disappeared, never to be seen again. There were whispers of a curse, an ancient force tied to reflections, one that had lingered for centuries. Matthews had trouble reconciling this with the logical part of his mind, but as the nights grew longer and the sense of dread enveloped him, he couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. The curse was real. The final clue came from an old, forgotten case file, buried deep within the archives of the police department. The case detailed the mysterious disappearance of a woman from a nearby town, a woman who had exhibited the same symptoms Claire had described. Her reflection, moving independently, a slow, methodical progression toward madness. The woman's body had never been found. And then it hit him. It was all connected. Claire's death wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. One evening, after another long day of investigating, Matthews sat alone in his apartment, his mind reeling from everything he had uncovered. His hand shook slightly as he reached for a glass of water. But as he moved past the kitchen, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the darkened hallway mirror. At first, he didn't notice anything unusual, but then something caught his eye, a subtle movement, just a beat too slow. Matthews froze. His reflection didn't move in sync with him. It lingered, a fraction of a second behind. For a moment, his blood ran cold. His reflection's face remained still, expressionless, while his own face twisted in disbelief. He took a step closer to the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. This couldn't be happening. His reflection mirrored his movements, but the delay grew longer. It was as though it was trying to communicate something to him, something dark and malevolent. His own body trembled as he stepped away from the mirror. "No," he whispered to himself, backing away, shaking his head. "It's just a trick. It's just in my head." But deep down, Matthews knew the truth. The reflection was real, and it was coming for him. Detective Ryan Matthews couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind was filled with visions of Claire Stanton, her terrified eyes locked in a desperate stare at her own reflection, her body slumped, lifeless, in front of the bathroom mirror. But it wasn't just Claire he couldn't escape. It was his own reflection, moving independently of him, mimicking his every gesture, but with an eerie delay. He had seen it, felt it, knew it was real. There were no rational explanations, no psychological theories that could account for what was happening to him. Everything he had uncovered during the investigation, the journal entries, Claire's words, the case files, pointed to something much darker, something beyond logic, beyond science. The reflection was alive. Matthews knew that the more he looked into this case, the deeper he would fall into its grip. But the truth was, he couldn't stop himself. He had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The case had changed him. It had seeped into his bones, into his very soul, and Matthews felt it in the pit of his stomach. The strange power that had once haunted Claire was now claiming him. He had to know why. He had to find the answer. The next morning, Matthews returned to the library where Claire had worked. Something about it felt like a crossroads, a place where answers might wait, hidden among the shelves of dusty books. The library was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Matthews had been here once before, but now, with the investigation in full swing, it felt different. The air seemed thicker, heavier, as though the walls were closing in. He made his way to the staff room, where he found Claire's co-workers, all of them stunned and mournful over her death. They shared their condolences, but also revealed little that Matthews didn't already know. But one detail stood out. One of Claire's colleagues, a woman named Lily, had been concerned about Claire's recent behavior, particularly her increasingly erratic shifts in mood. Claire had spent hours talking about strange occurrences she had witnessed in the library mirrors, glass surfaces, and windows, things that were too bizarre for Lily to understand. Claire. She used to talk about the mirrors all the time. She'd sit in front of them, like she was waiting for something, Lily explained, her voice quiet, almost ashamed of speaking of her late friend in such a way. I thought maybe it was just her stress from therapy, but now that she's gone, I don't know. Maybe there was more to it. Matthews felt his stomach twist. More to it. He asked Lily if she could recall anything specific, any odd occurrences Claire had mentioned. Lily paused. There was one thing. She said she had a dream once, a recurring one. She said she was in a room, alone with her reflection. But the reflection wasn't her. It was someone else, someone dark. And that reflection told her that the only way to escape it was to let it take over, that it was inevitable. Matthews felt his pulse quicken. Let it take over. That was exactly what Claire had been afraid of, wasn't it? She had written it in her journal, had talked about it in her therapy sessions. The reflection wasn't just an illusion. It was trying to replace her. And now Matthews wondered, was that what was happening to him? He thanked Lily and left the library, feeling the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had to get back to Claire's apartment. There was something there he still hadn't uncovered, something vital that might explain the connection between Claire's death and her family's curse. That evening, Matthews found himself back at Claire Stanton's apartment. The place still felt haunted, the air heavy with the remnants of her last moments. Every creak of the old floorboards, every flicker of light seemed to whisper to him. The silence in the room was suffocating, but Matthews pressed on. He needed to know. He had to piece this together before it was too late. He approached the bathroom mirror again. It was the same mirror that had reflected Claire in her final moments. It had once reflected her fear, her struggle, her final breath. And now it seemed to mock Matthews, drawing him in. His reflection, as if sensing his intent, remained still for a moment. But as he stared at it, it began to move just slightly, just enough for him to notice. His hand twitched. The reflection mirrored him, but the movement was delayed, just like Claire's. It was as though the reflection was testing him, learning from him. Matthews forced himself to take a deep breath, reaching for the drawer beneath the mirror. He pulled it open with a creak, revealing a few of Claire's belongings, a photo album, some notes, and a half-filled journal. Matthews picked up the journal and began flipping through the pages. It was almost identical to the ones he had read earlier, frantic, anxious, filled with the same disturbing notes. But there was something new. The last entry, written in a hurried, jagged script, sent a chill through his body. I can feel it now. It's closer. It's inside me. The reflection is not just a thing. It's a force, a shadow. I tried to fight it, but now I see the truth. It has been inside me all along. I just didn't know. It's waiting for the right moment to take over. Matthew's hands trembled as he turned the page. His breath came in shallow gasps. The entry was eerily prophetic, too accurate. How had Claire known? How had she understood the true nature of what was happening? His reflection, still in the background of the bathroom mirror, twisted unnaturally. The light flickered, and Matthews could swear he saw something else staring back at him. A shadow, an outline of something dark and formless, lurking just behind his image. With a start, Matthews stumbled backward. His heart raced as the world around him seemed to close in. The mirror was no longer just a reflective surface. It had become a portal, a doorway to something much darker. Matthews's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest as he stared at the mirror. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to turn away, to flee. But he couldn't. The reflection, no, the thing in the reflection, had him mesmerized. There was something familiar about it, something twisted and wrong. Suddenly, the reflection grinned. Matthews froze. It wasn't his grin. It was a cruel, mocking expression, one that sent a surge of dread through his entire body. He stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat, but the thing in the mirror followed him, its grin widening, the eyes growing darker. It's too late now. The reflection whispered in a voice that was not Matthew's. He spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but the room was empty. His eyes darted back to the mirror, and in a sickening moment of realization, Matthews understood. It wasn't just a mirror. It was a prison. The reflection was the prisoner. His hand shook violently as he reached for his phone, dialing his partner back at the station. "Detective Matthews," he said quickly. "I need everything we have on the Stanton case. Now, and get me a team to Claire Stanton's apartment. There's something here. Something I missed." As he hung up, Matthews felt the weight of the room's silence press in on him once more. The darkness was closing in. The next day, Matthews couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control. The reflection wasn't just something that followed him. It was becoming him. He could feel it now, a creeping sensation in his bones, in his veins. It was as if it had always been a part of him, waiting for the right moment to take over. As the hours passed, Matthews began to realize that the only way to stop this, whatever this was to confront it head on. He had to end it before it consumed him, before it dragged him into its depths. With grim resolve, Matthews set out for Claire's apartment once more. There was a final piece to the puzzle he hadn't yet uncovered, something buried deep in the apartment's hidden corners. The truth about the curse, about the force that haunted the reflections, was within his grasp, and the only way to stop it was to face it in the final reflection. The air in Claire Stanton's apartment was thick, almost oppressive, as Matthews stood in front of the bathroom mirror once again. He had returned here, despite the fear gnawing at him, because he knew the truth was hidden in this room. Claire's final moments had been spent here, in front of this glass, staring into the abyss. Matthews clenched his fists, determined to find the key to ending this nightmare. The mirror was still, eerily calm, as if it had no intention of revealing its secrets. He reached for his phone and dialed the lab, hoping for something tangible, something to make sense of the surreal events he'd been experiencing. "Detective Matthews?" came the voice on the other end, sharp and clear. "Any progress on the reflection experiments?" Matthews asked, his voice tight. "We've run every test we could think of, but there's something unusual." the lab tech said, pausing. The mirrors, specifically the reflective surfaces, show subtle but undeniable anomalies in the way light is refracted, almost like an imprint left behind, like a second layer of reality underneath the surface. It doesn't make sense. We're still testing it. But this phenomenon, it's not just optical. It's as if there are multiple layers of reality folding into one. Matthew's blood ran cold. Multiple layers of reality. He had suspected something otherworldly was at play, but hearing those words from a lab tech made it all too real. The reflections weren't just reflections. They were windows to something else, something darker, something with its own intentions. But what? He ended the call, his hand shaking as he slipped the phone back into his pocket. The air in the room felt colder now. The mirror seemed to beckon him, whispering secrets it had kept for so long. He stepped closer, his breath shallow. The surface of the glass appeared almost alive. He stared into his reflection, searching for any hint of the truth, but his own face only stared back at him, eyes wide and confused. He wasn't sure what he was looking for anymore. Was it the reflection of himself, or something far worse? Suddenly, a flicker, a dark shadow in the corner of the glass. Matthews froze. The reflection didn't move with him. It was as if it was being controlled by something else entirely. The shadow in the corner seemed to shift, almost like it was drawing nearer, encroaching upon him. His heart raced, the blood pounding in his ears. The mirror. It wasn't just showing him an image of himself anymore. It was showing him something he couldn't understand. The air in the room grew heavy, oppressive. Matthews reached out a hand, his reflection mirroring him. But there was no longer any delay. It was too smooth, too synchronized. Then, the reflection grinned, an unnatural cold smile that was not his own. Matthews recoiled, his stomach churning. "No," he whispered. "This isn't happening." The reflection's grin widened, growing sinister, and Matthews stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The face in the mirror twisted, contorted, as if it were coming to life. A sudden chill filled the room, like an ice-cold breath on the back of his neck. The whispering began, soft at first, just on the edge of hearing, but then louder, more distinct. "You can't escape me," the reflection's voice taunted, cold and hollow. "You never could." Matthews recoiled, his body trembling as the words echoed in his mind. "You never could." The reflection raised a hand, its movements sharp and deliberate. Matthew's own reflection mimicked him perfectly, but with each second, the disconnection between reality and what he saw grew wider. It was no longer just an image. It was alive. Before Matthews could move, the reflection's hand slammed against the glass, and the sound of shattering echoed through the room. The glass didn't break, but the surface rippled as if a wave had passed through it, distorting the reflection. And then, in a horrifying moment of clarity, Matthews understood. The reflection wasn't just a mirror. It was a doorway. He stumbled backward, gasping for air, his mind racing. The reflection had been trying to break free, and now it had. The force that had driven Claire to madness, that had haunted her family, was alive within the mirror. It had been waiting for the right moment to escape, and that moment had come. Matthews didn't have much time. He needed to stop it. But how? As if answering his unspoken question, the mirror rippled again, and the shadow took shape, slowly becoming more defined. A figure, dark and contorted, stepped from within the glass, a twisted, monstrous version of Matthews himself. Its eyes were dark, voids of blackness, and its smile was full of malice. It was him, but it wasn't. It was a reflection. a reflection that had taken on a life of its own. Matthew screamed in terror, stumbling away from the mirror as the figure stepped closer, its grin widening. It was no longer bound by the glass. It was free. The thing in the mirror, the shadow, lunged toward him. Matthews barely managed to get his bearings, his heart racing as the twisted reflection closed the distance between them. It was moving now, its movements sharp and unnatural, like a predator closing in on its prey. Matthews turned and ran toward the door, his mind reeling. What the hell was happening? But no matter how fast he moved, he could hear it behind him, the echoes of his own footsteps, but louder, distorted. It was as though the reflection was following him in the very air itself. Matthews burst into the hallway, his pulse thundering in his ears. He could hear the thing closing in, growing closer, its presence suffocating. It wasn't just the mirror anymore. It was all around him. The walls seemed to warp and stretch, the air thick with dread. He was no longer sure if this was reality or something else entirely. He stumbled to the apartment's front door, but it wouldn't open. Panic surged within him. The reflection had trapped him, locked him in the same way it had trapped Claire. The glass was a prison, but it was also a doorway to a world that shouldn't exist, and the reflection had come to claim him. Matthews pressed his hand against the door, his chest heaving, his breath shallow. The reflection wasn't just in the mirror. It was inside him, inside his mind, inside his body, controlling him, pulling him into its depths. He could feel it crawling under his skin, twisting, turning, urging him to let go, to become it. But Matthews wouldn't give in. Not yet. There had to be a way to stop this. There had to be a way to sever the connection, to break the hold the reflection had over him. He thought back to Claire's journals, to the desperate words she had written. There was a clue, a way to break the curse. With trembling hands, Matthews pulled the journal from his coat pocket, flipping through the pages. His eyes scanned the final entry, the one Claire had written just before her death. It's not a curse, it's a choice. We can choose to break the reflection, or it will break us. I won't let it take me, not without a fight. A choice. It clicked. The reflection was not some external force beyond their control. It was tied to their will, their fear, their acceptance. Claire had understood it, but she hadn't been strong enough to fight it. But Matthews still had a chance. Matthew's mind raced, the words of Claire's final journal entry echoing in his ears. It's not a curse, it's a choice. We can choose to break the reflection, or it will break us. The reflection had been trying to take over, not just Claire, but everyone it came in contact with. The force that had haunted Claire's family, that had twisted her life into a nightmare, was the same force Matthews now found himself face to face with. It was an entity born of fear, a presence that existed only through the act of accepting its control. And now, it had its claws in him. His own reflection grinned wider, its eyes black voids, hollow, filled with something that wasn't human. It raised its hand slowly, mirroring Matthew's own movements with a deliberate, mocking slowness. The reflection had become a shadow of his mind, a dark extension of his own fears and doubts. Matthews swallowed hard, his pulse hammering in his throat. He had to act, now. There was no time to waste. The reflection wasn't just an image, it was alive, and if he didn't fight it, if he didn't push it back into the mirror, it would consume him. You think you can escape me? The reflection's voice was low, guttural, filled with venom. It stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, like it was a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. You're me. You always were. You can't fight yourself. The room seemed to close in on Matthews, the walls warping and breathing around him, a living nightmare unfolding. He could feel the presence of the reflection all around him, pressing against his mind, suffocating him. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the air had turned to lead. His heart raced, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. "No," Matthews whispered, his voice shaking. "You're not me." The reflection stopped, its grin widening even more, eyes filled with dark amusement. "I am everything you fear, detective. Everything you've hidden from the world. Everything you've repressed. I am your weakness, and I will consume you." Matthews took a step back, but the reflection remained frozen, watching him with malicious glee. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Claire's journal. He had no time left. He had to find the answer, the key, the way to break the curse, before the reflection fully took hold of him. It's a choice. A choice. Matthew's eyes flicked over the pages of the journal, his hands trembling as he searched for the hidden truth. The journal had been Claire's lifeline, her only way of holding on to her sanity as the reflection twisted her mind. There had to be something more, something buried within these pages that would help him sever the connection. And then he found it. There, hidden at the bottom of the last page, was a phrase written in a hurried, frantic scrawl. To break the reflection, you must choose what is real. You must choose yourself, not the mirror. Do not accept it. Reject it. With all your heart. The answer was simple and terrifying. He had to reject the reflection. He had to deny its existence, deny its hold on him. He couldn't look at it anymore. He couldn't acknowledge it as part of him. He had to sever the link between them completely. But that meant he had to let go of the fear, the doubt, the pain that had always been a part of him. He had to fight the most powerful part of himself, the darkest thoughts, the weaknesses that had been buried deep within. Matthews closed his eyes and took a slow, steadying breath. His mind screamed at him to look at the reflection, to fight it with every ounce of his being, but he knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about his reflection, it was about his soul. He turned his back to the mirror. The room went deathly quiet, as though time had frozen. Matthews's heart pounded, his thoughts racing, the reflection's presence still looming over him, waiting for him to falter. But he didn't look back. He wouldn't. Instead, he focused on himself, on who he was, on everything he had fought for. His career, his integrity, the part of him that had always strived for justice. He wasn't the monster the reflection wanted him to become. He wasn't the failure, the fear, the weakness. He was stronger than the darkness. Slowly, Matthews stepped away from the mirror, his eyes fixed on the door. He wouldn't let the reflection win. Not today. Not ever. "Leave me," he muttered under his breath. "I am not you." The silence in the room became deafening. For a moment, nothing happened. Matthews's breath came in shallow gasps as he waited for the reflection to strike, for the grip of terror to take hold of him. But it didn't. The reflection did not move. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Matthews allowed himself to open his eyes. He turned slowly, fearing what he might see. The mirror was empty. There was no twisted figure, no monstrous version of himself, no dark entity waiting to claim him. The glass was calm, smooth, its surface clear and ordinary. His reflection, his true reflection, stared back at him, tired but unbroken. It was over. Matthews stood there, breathing heavily, as the weight of the past few days seemed to finally lift from his shoulders. His heart still raced, but now there was a strange sense of peace, a calm that he hadn't felt since he'd first laid eyes on Claire Stanton's lifeless body. For a long moment, he simply stared at his reflection. The fear, the terror, the uncertainty, they were gone. And in their place, Matthews saw something he hadn't seen in a long time. Himself. The man who had faced his demons and had fought to make things right. But it wasn't just that. Matthews realized that the mirror, the reflection, had never been the true enemy. The real enemy had been the fear inside of him. The fear that he was weak. The fear that he couldn't face the darkness in his own soul. The reflection had been a manifestation of that fear, a force that fed on his insecurities and doubts. And now, for the first time in a long time, he could finally let go. He stepped away from the mirror, his mind clear, his heart lighter. He had won. He had chosen himself. But as he walked toward the door, he felt a strange, unsettling presence behind him. A whisper, barely audible, like the faintest echo of something that wasn't quite finished. Matthews froze, his hand on the door handle. He turned slowly, expecting to see the reflection return. But it wasn't the reflection that spoke. A voice, cold and malevolent, filled the room. "You may have won this time, Matthews, but there are always more reflections, and they never forget." Matthews's breath caught in his throat. The door swung open, and he stepped out into the hallway, the chilling whisper lingering in the air behind him. As Matthews walked away from Claire Stanton's apartment, the weight of what had happened settled over him. He had broken the curse, but there was a lingering feeling in the back of his mind, like a shadow he couldn't shake. The reflection, that dark force, hadn't been completely vanquished. It was still out there, waiting for its next victim. He couldn't help but wonder, had he truly won, or had he merely delayed the inevitable? The mirror had been quiet for now, but Matthews knew that some battles weren't just fought in the physical world. Some battles were fought in the mind, and the reflection would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the next moment of weakness. But for now, Matthews had his peace. He had chosen himself, and that was a victory he would hold on to for as long as he could. Mark Kingston wasn't the sort of man anyone would remember for long. At 32, he had come to accept the dull rhythm of his life. The promise of success he once held had long faded, leaving behind only the wreckage of past aspirations. He had once been a star employee at a prestigious software company, climbing the ranks, confident in his brilliance. But one bad decision had crushed everything. One line of code, one mistake, and the whole project had collapsed. The company, embarrassed by the failure, had fired him without hesitation. That had been 5 years ago. Since then, Mark had spiraled, unable to find another job in his field. The tech industry had moved on without him, and his skill set, once so highly valued, was now deemed outdated. The bills piled up, relationships frayed, and soon he found himself alone in a small, crumbling apartment on the edge of the city. Sarah, his wife, had left him a year ago, unable to handle the tension and pressure that came with living with a man whose light had dimmed. His days followed a grim routine. Wake up, check his email for jobs that never came, browse social media to watch the lives of others unfold, and wait for the next day to feel just like the last. He had no real friends left, no ambition, just an aching sense of stagnation. The world outside felt like a blur, a series of disconnected moments he couldn't seem to touch. But today was different. Mark had wandered aimlessly to the outskirts of town in search of something, though he didn't know what. Maybe it was the need to feel a change, even a small one. He walked through a local flea market, one that seemed to sprout up only on weekends. The market was alive with the noise of vendors shouting their wares and the scent of grease from food trucks filling the air. There was nothing special about the market. It was full of old books, random electronics, broken appliances, and faded clothes. As he meandered through the crowd, something caught his eye. A small table piled high with electronics, a few old radios, a few dusty phones, some tangled wires, and sitting in the center, almost like it was waiting for him, was a sleek black smartphone. It was almost too new for a flea market, its surface free from scratches, its screen still gleaming. It didn't belong here. The vendor, an older man with a grizzled beard and a limp, noticed Mark eyeing the phone. "That's a good one," the man rasped. "Barely used. Good deal. Just $100. Mark stared at the price tag. $100. It seemed too low, too convenient. But his mind was too numb to question it. He'd seen phones at pawn shops, online marketplaces, and second-hand stores for triple the price. Something about this phone, something about the way it called to him, compelled him to buy it. "I'll take it," Mark said, before he could talk himself out of it. That night, Mark sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the phone in his hands. It wasn't much different from the one he had owned years ago, sleek, black, and minimalist. But it felt different in a way he couldn't explain. The air around him seemed heavier, as if he were holding something he wasn't supposed to have. His old phone had been barely functional. It was an outdated model, its battery long dead. But this phone was different. It powered on quickly, and the screen glowed brightly in the dark. Mark explored the apps at first, dismissing them as nothing special. Standard social media, a few weather apps, some news feeds. But as he swiped through, he came across something that made him pause. A photo gallery. But it wasn't like any gallery he'd ever seen before. This app had no name, only a black square with a white camera lens icon in the center. Mark tapped on it, curiosity eating at him. What he saw nearly made his heart stop. It wasn't a typical photo gallery. The images were dark, graphic, and disturbing, horrific even. Photos of crimes, accidents, and disasters, bloodied faces, fires, broken windows. Each photo was time-stamped and dated, down to the exact hour. Mark's breath caught in his throat. One of the images showed a woman lying on the floor of a grocery store, blood pooling around her. The caption beneath it read, "Date, tomorrow. Location, Oakwood Market. Time, 2:45 p.m. The details were so precise, it made his stomach churn. Mark scrolled through the gallery, each photo more unsettling than the last. There were no captions, no descriptions, just the images, terrible images, each one tied to a future date. His mind raced. Was this some kind of sick joke? An elaborate prank? He went back to the first image, the one that had unsettled him so deeply. It was of a man he didn't know, standing on a busy street corner, looking helpless, his face frozen in terror. The timestamp, tomorrow, 8 p.m. Mark sat back, his palms clammy. The photo was too clear, too detailed. What if it wasn't a joke? What if it was real? He stared at the screen, feeling like the world around him was beginning to close in. The phone had somehow seen into the future. The photos weren't just random. They were predictions. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as a thought hit him like a brick. What if I could stop these things from happening? But then the self-doubt kicked in. It seemed impossible, ridiculous, and yet the thought lingered, insistent. The next day, Mark couldn't shake the thoughts of the photos. The idea that something, or someone, had predicted a violent event with such terrifying accuracy gnawed at him. By afternoon, He couldn't hold back his curiosity any longer. He checked the photo of the man on the street corner. 8 p.m. That was tonight. Mark stared at the clock. It was already 7:30 p.m. He debated with himself for a few minutes, then grabbed his coat and headed out the door. The streets were busier than usual, people rushing home after a long day of work, the low hum of traffic filling the air. Mark's heart beat faster as he walked to the street corner that the phone had shown him. He couldn't believe he was doing this, but something in him, something deep inside, compelled him to go. As he approached the intersection, he scanned the crowd, and then he saw him, the man in the photo. He was standing at the corner, just as the phone had predicted. His face was terrified, his eyes darting nervously. Mark froze. The image had been exact. The same man, same posture, same terrified expression. The timestamp on the photo, 8 p.m., was almost upon him. Mark didn't know what to do. Should he intervene? Should he warn the man? Would it even matter? Before he could decide, the situation escalated. A car, speeding recklessly down the road, swerved off course. The driver, panicked, maybe drunk, lost control of the wheel. Mark watched in horror as the car careened toward the man on the corner. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The man saw the car at the last second, his face contorting in fear. But it was too late. The vehicle slammed into him, sending him flying through the air. Mark screamed, running toward the scene, but it was no use. The man was already unconscious, blood pooling around him. This was no coincidence. The photos on the phone hadn't lied. Mark's mind spun. Could this really be happening? The weeks that followed were a blur. Every day, Mark checked the phone's gallery, watching the photos of disasters and crimes unfold with horrific precision. It wasn't just coincidence anymore. The predictions were happening, exactly as the phone had shown. At first, Mark had tried to do something, anything, about it. He'd tried to intervene, but each time, things had already happened. The phone seemed to hold a terrifying power. It didn't just predict the future. It locked it into place, forcing Mark to witness events he had no control over. Mark spent the next few days in a haze. The photos on the phone had not stopped. Every time he looked, there was something new. Another violent act, another tragedy, each one more precise than the last. He could no longer ignore the sinking feeling that the phone was showing him a version of reality he wasn't supposed to know. And each time he saw one of these events unfold, he felt more powerless. He had to do something. Mark spent hours trying to find any connection between the events in the photos. He scoured news websites, diving into articles and reports, looking for patterns, for clues that might explain the connection between the events and the photos. But nothing made sense. The phone didn't just capture random acts of violence. It seemed to have a strange accuracy to it. Each photo was tied to a date, a location, and the people involved. Yet there was no obvious link to any overarching conspiracy or organization. That was when he decided to reach out for help. On a Friday evening, Mark found himself standing in front of a small cafe in the city. The sign read, "Olivia Dunn, investigative journalist," and it had been one of the few places in the city that still felt like a place for truth seekers. He'd seen Olivia's work before. Articles on unsolved mysteries, reports about corruption in local law enforcement, investigations into missing persons. Her writing had a tenacity to it, a search for something deeper than what was visible on the surface. Mark wasn't sure why, but he felt like she might be the only person who would believe him. He walked inside, and the warm scent of coffee and pastries hit him. Olivia was seated at a corner booth, her back to the wall. She looked up as he approached, giving him a quick, assessing glance. There was something about the way she looked at him that made him feel like she was already trying to figure him out. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady, calm. Mark hesitated. He didn't know where to begin, how to explain what had happened. "I need your help," he said finally, sliding into the seat opposite her. I have something you need to see." Olivia raised an eyebrow, but she didn't say anything. She just waited, her pen hovering over a notebook, ready to write whatever came next. Mark pulled out the phone, placing it on the table between them. Olivia's eyes immediately went to it, and she picked it up without hesitation. "What's this?" she asked, her tone a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. It's a phone I found, but it's not like any phone I've ever seen," Mark explained, his voice trembling slightly. "I think it shows the future." Olivia glanced at him, clearly trying to read him. "The future?" She let out a small laugh, but there was no amusement in her eyes. "You do realize that sounds insane, right?" "I know it sounds crazy. I thought I was losing my mind too," Mark said, his voice tightening. "But I've seen it. These photos, they show things that haven't happened yet. Murders, accidents, things that are going to happen." Olivia narrowed her eyes, but she didn't dismiss him outright. She flicked the phone back on, scrolling through the gallery of photos. Her fingers moved quickly, her brow furrowing with each image she saw. Mark held his breath as she looked at the photos, faces, locations, times. Olivia's expression shifted from skepticism to concern, and then, after a long pause, she finally spoke. This is impossible," she said softly. "But if it's true, then we need to find out where this phone came from and who is behind it." Mark nodded, relief washing over him. He had expected her to laugh him off, but she didn't. She was taking him seriously. "We need to investigate," Olivia continued. "We need to track down the source of this phone, figure out who created it and why." Mark was already feeling the weight of the situation. There was no turning back now. If Olivia was right, if they could find the origin of the phone, then maybe, just maybe, they could uncover the truth behind it. The first step in the investigation was to find out where the phone had come from. Mark and Olivia spent days scouring every piece of information they could find about the device, searching for any clue about its origins. They traced the phone's serial number, but it led nowhere. Just a blank page. There were no records of the phone's purchase, no manufacturer information that led to a legitimate source. Mark began to feel the pressure of the situation. His life, once so mundane, had been irrevocably altered. Every passing moment seemed to bring him closer to something dark and terrifying. He couldn't stop thinking about the photos, the future it revealed. More specifically, he couldn't stop thinking about the next photo he had seen. It was of a woman, someone he cared about, someone close to him. The photo was crystal clear. The woman's face was unmistakable, Olivia. The caption beneath the photo was as chilling as the others. Date, 3 days from now. Location, 5th and Pine. Time, 3 p.m. There was no mistaking it. It was Olivia, and she was going to be in some kind of danger. Mark could no longer ignore the terror rising in his chest. He had to warn her. He had to do something. The problem was, Olivia was already on edge. She had started to become obsessed with the phone as well, researching its potential connection to a mysterious figure who had disappeared years ago. Someone who had allegedly been conducting experiments involving time, fate, and technology. The more they uncovered, the darker the truth seemed to be. There were whispers of underground organizations, government experiments, and fringe scientific research that pushed the boundaries of reality itself. Mark didn't want to drag Olivia into this. He He couldn't bear the thought of something happening to her, but the photo was undeniable. He had to stop whatever was coming for her. But how? Olivia, ever the investigative journalist, had already made plans. "We'll go to the location," she said, a determined look in her eyes. "We'll see what's happening there." Mark didn't want her to go. He couldn't stand the thought of it. But Olivia was insistent. She believed in the phone's power, just like he did, and she was determined to get answers. The closer they got to uncovering the source, the more dangerous the investigation became. But Mark knew one thing for sure. If he didn't stop what was coming, Olivia would be the next victim. It was 2:30 p.m. on the day Olivia was meant to meet her fate. Mark stood at the corner of 5th and Pine, his palms slick with sweat. The crowd around him moved in their typical rhythms, people walking to and from work, chatting on the phone, rushing to their destinations. He had no idea what exactly was going to happen, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was coming. Olivia was supposed to be here at 3 p.m., just as the photo predicted. But what would happen when she arrived? His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Olivia. "I'm here," she said, her voice tense. "I don't know what's going to happen, but I can feel something. This doesn't feel right." Mark's heart raced. "Stay where you are. Don't come near the intersection. I have to find out what's going on." He looked around, scanning the area for anything unusual. As the clock inched closer to 3 p.m., he began to feel the weight of his choice. Should he interfere? Could he really stop fate? The photos had shown him a future, but what would happen if he tried to change it? Would it even matter? Then, everything shifted. A car came barreling down the street, speeding through the intersection, right toward Olivia. Mark's blood ran cold as he saw the vehicle careening out of control. There was no time to think, only to act. He ran toward the intersection, shouting at Olivia, but it was too late. The car skidded to a stop just inches from her, sending a wave of shock through the crowd. Olivia was thrown backward, but miraculously, she wasn't hit. The car had stopped just in time. Mark stood there panting, his heart still racing. The photo had been right, but so was the phone. Something had happened, and he had managed to stop it, even if it was only by the smallest margin. But the question remained, had he changed fate, or was this just another part of the plan? After the near miss at 5th and Pine, Mark's mind was reeling. Olivia was unharmed, but only barely. The car had come so close to her that the entire crowd had frozen in shock. Mark had never been more terrified in his life. But as he helped Olivia to her feet, and they moved away from the intersection, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. They had changed the future. The photos on the phone had shown Olivia in danger, but by intervening, they had prevented the worst from occurring. However, Mark couldn't shake the nagging thought that they hadn't truly stopped the disaster. They had just delayed it. Olivia was still in a daze, trying to process what had happened. Mark took her hand and pulled her into a nearby coffee shop, away from the gawking pedestrians. He needed to speak to her, to tell her everything he had uncovered. The photos, the phone's predictions, and the disturbing implications of everything that had come to light. "Olivia, Mark began, but Olivia interrupted him. "I saw it," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw the car coming. It was like I could feel it in my bones. I don't know how to explain it, but I knew it was going to happen. I knew it." Mark took a deep breath. "I know. I think we're starting to realize what this phone is capable of. It's not just showing us the future, it's locking us into it." Olivia frowned. "Locking us in? You mean..." I think it's more than just predictions. I think it's shaping the future. But there's something else. Something behind all of this. Olivia's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Mark hesitated, unsure whether he should reveal everything he had found. But he knew there was no turning back now. I've been looking into the phone's origins, and I've found something disturbing. He pulled out his laptop, showing Olivia the files he had dug up. The name of the man who had created the phone was one that Mark had stumbled upon during his late-night searches. Dr. Albert Hawthorne. He had been a prominent physicist working on classified government experiments involving time manipulation and the potential to alter the course of events. According to the records Mark had uncovered, Dr. Hawthorne had vanished 5 years ago without a trace, leaving behind a series of cryptic research papers and a number of incomplete experiments. I think this phone is connected to Dr. Hawthorne's work, Mark continued. His research wasn't just about time travel, but about predicting and manipulating events before they happened. He wanted to create a way to control fate itself. Olivia was silent, staring at the information on the screen. So you're saying this phone is some kind of experiment? Mark nodded. Yes. And it's not just an experiment. It's a weapon. Someone is using this phone to manipulate the future, or at least to view it. Maybe even alter it. And I think they're watching us now. Olivia leaned back, trying to process everything. But why would they give it to you? Why did you find it at a flea market? That's what we need to find out, Mark said. I think the person who left it there knew I'd find it. I'm just a pawn in this bigger game. But I need your help. I need to understand more about Dr. Hawthorne's disappearance. Olivia nodded, her investigative instincts kicking in. We'll find him, Mark. We'll find out what happened to Dr. Hawthorne and stop whoever is behind this. Mark and Olivia's investigation led them into dark, uncharted territory. They dug deeper into Dr. Hawthorne's research, tracing his last known whereabouts to a now abandoned facility on the outskirts of the city. The building had once been part of a larger government research project, a facility known only as the Lab, a place that had been rumored to conduct unethical experiments on time and space itself. The closer they got to the truth, the more they began to feel like they were being followed. Mark's every move was scrutinized, and Olivia began receiving strange messages, cryptic warnings, and ominous threats on her phone. But they refused to back down. They managed to track down a former colleague of Dr. Hawthorne's, a scientist named Catherine Voss, who had worked with him before his disappearance. Catherine was now living off the grid, hiding from the very people who had once funded her research. Meeting her wasn't easy. Catherine had gone to great lengths to erase any trace of her past life. She was paranoid, disheveled, and suspicious of Mark and Olivia's motives. It took hours of convincing before she finally agreed to speak to them. What you're asking about, Catherine said, her voice hushed, is dangerous. Dr. Hawthorne's work. It was never meant to see the light of day. You have no idea the power that phone holds. It's not just about predicting the future. It's about changing it. And once you change one thing, the entire fabric of reality starts to unravel. Mark and Olivia exchanged uneasy glances. Catherine continued. Dr. Hawthorne's research was based on quantum physics. He believed that time wasn't linear. It was malleable. His theories were so radical, so out there, that the government decided to fund him under the table. But something went wrong. The experiments didn't just predict the future. They manipulated it. They created anomalies. And those anomalies, they can't be controlled. Not anymore. Olivia leaned forward. What do you mean? If the phone is based on his research, what happens when you change the future? What happens to the present? Catherine looked grim. It creates a cascade effect. Small changes ripple out, causing larger and larger distortions. Eventually, time fractures. The past, present, and future start to bleed into each other. And once that happens, there's no going back. Mark felt the weight of her words sink in. The phone wasn't just showing them the future, it was manipulating it. And the consequences were far worse than he had imagined. Catherine went on, her voice shaking. I don't know who has the phone now, but I can tell you this much. They don't know what they're playing with. If they keep using it, things will only get worse. We need to find Dr. Hawthorne, Olivia said, her voice firm. If we can find him, we can stop this. We can stop whatever is happening before it's too late. Catherine paused, looking over her shoulder nervously. The last time I saw Dr. Hawthorne, he was trying to destroy everything. He realized what he had done, but the people he worked for, they didn't want to let go. They kept pushing him, using him for their own ends. And now, I'm afraid it's too late. The damage is done. Mark stood up, determination in his eyes. Then we'll stop them. We have to. Their search for Dr. Hawthorne led them to the abandoned facility, where the final pieces of the puzzle lay waiting. The building was a fortress of silence and decay, with rusted steel doors and shattered windows. As Mark and Olivia stepped inside, the air felt heavy, as though it had been holding its breath for years. They descended into the heart of the building, through a maze of dark corridors, lined with forgotten research papers and broken equipment. At the very end of the hall, they found a door that had been sealed shut for years. A door that, according to Catherine, led to Dr. Hawthorne's private lab. They managed to force the door open, and inside, they found the remnants of Dr. Hawthorne's final experiment. A massive, complex machine that hummed with a faint, otherworldly energy. It was unlike anything Mark had ever seen before. An intricate array of wires, screens, and strange symbols. On a nearby table, there was a final journal entry from Dr. Hawthorne, detailing his last moments before disappearing. I've seen the end, I've seen the future, and it is broken. The phone, the device, it's not just a tool, it's a tether to a future that no one should control. The experiment was a mistake, and now there is no going back. The consequences are already set in motion. If someone is using it now, they will not stop until everything is destroyed. Mark's blood ran cold as he read the final words. The phone is the key, he whispered. It's what's keeping everything together. And if we destroy it, we might be able to stop everything from falling apart. With the truth laid bare before them, Mark and Olivia realized they had no choice but to confront the shadowy organization behind the phone and put an end to it once and for all. But the closer they got to the source, the more dangerous the situation became. The final showdown would force them to face the true power of the phone, its ability to manipulate fate itself, and the terrifying consequences of trying to destroy it. Mark stood in front of the machine, staring at the swirling, pulsating lights. The hum of energy reverberated through the metal floor beneath his feet, and the weight of what he was about to do settled over him like a thick fog. He could feel it in his bones, the immense power that the phone and the experiments behind it held. It wasn't just a phone. It was a catalyst. It was the key to manipulating fate itself. Olivia stood beside him, her expression grim, yet resolute. She had seen the truth now, just as he had. The phone wasn't just an accidental byproduct of Dr. Hawthorne's research. It was a weapon, a tool for altering time itself, and the organization behind it had no intentions of stopping. They had no regard for the destruction it could cause. the unraveling of the very fabric of reality. All they cared about was control. Control over the future, control over life and death, and the ability to predict and ultimately manipulate events before they happened. They had to end it. "We don't have much time," Olivia said, her voice tight with urgency. "They're coming for us. We can't let them take the phone." Mark nodded, his mind focused. "We need to destroy the phone and the machine. If we don't, the cascade effect will keep getting worse. Time will keep breaking down, and it'll be too late for anyone to stop it." Olivia's face was pale, but she didn't flinch. She had seen the destruction the phone could cause, seen how it could manipulate events, warp the future, and turn it into a nightmare. The photos they had uncovered weren't just predictions. They were manifestations of the future that had been bent to fit someone's agenda, someone who had already begun exploiting the chaos. The lab was silent, except for the low hum of the machine. Mark's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the phone, still nestled in his pocket. The device felt heavier than it ever had before, as if it were aware of the fate that was about to unfold. He couldn't help but wonder, had the phone known this moment would come? Had it been waiting for him to destroy it? He took the phone in his hand, staring at its dark screen. The photos were gone now, replaced by a single message: "You cannot change the future." Mark's breath caught in his throat. It was as if the phone had spoken to him, challenging his every instinct, mocking his attempts to take control. But he couldn't back down now. He had to destroy it. He had to stop this before everything fell apart. Olivia stood beside him, holding a small explosive device in her hands. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice low but determined. Mark didn't reply immediately. He wasn't sure what it meant to be ready anymore. But he knew one thing: if they didn't act now, the future would continue to unravel in ways they couldn't even imagine. They would be powerless to stop it. The destruction would spread like wildfire, with no way to put it out. He looked at Olivia. "Do it." Olivia set the device down near the base of the machine and stepped back, eyes locked on the phone. They had one shot, one chance to end this madness. Once the device was activated, they wouldn't be able to stop it. It was a desperate move, but it was their only option. With a deep breath, Olivia pressed a button on the device. The countdown began. Mark felt the world around him shift, as if the very air had become thick with tension. He glanced at the phone in his hand, almost expecting it to react, to flash with a warning, to show him another photo of what would happen next. But nothing came. The phone remained dark, silent, as if it had already accepted its fate. The countdown ticked on, and Mark's mind raced. Would this work? Would destroying the phone and the machine really stop everything? As the final seconds of the countdown passed, the ground beneath them began to tremble. A low rumble, like thunder echoing from deep within the earth, shook the lab. The hum of the machine grew louder, almost deafening, as the energy within it surged. Mark could feel the pulse of it in his chest, a sickening, oppressive force, as if time itself was pushing back against the destruction they were about to unleash. Then, the door at the far end of the lab slammed open. The organization had arrived. Figures in dark suits and sunglasses flooded the room, moving with precision, their faces cold and unreadable. They were armed, their weapons trained on Mark and Olivia. But Mark wasn't afraid. He had come too far to turn back now. He could hear the countdown in his head, the seconds ticking away. "You don't have to do this," one of the figures said, his voice smooth and authoritative. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room, fixing on the phone in Mark's hand. You have no idea what you're tampering with. Mark glared at him, his grip tightening around the phone. I know exactly what I'm tampering with. And it's over. It's done. The man smiled, a cold, predatory smile. You think you can destroy the future? You think you can control time? You're a fool. You don't control time, Olivia shot back, stepping in front of Mark. You manipulate it. You use it to create chaos. But chaos isn't control. It's destruction. Mark's heart raced as the seconds on the countdown ticked away. He knew they couldn't win in a direct confrontation. They had no choice but to rely on the device to do the work for them. They had no time left. The world was about to change, whether they were ready or not. The man took another step forward. This is your last chance, Mark. You can walk away. You can join us. Together, we can shape the future. We can predict everything, control everything. Mark shook his head, a deep sense of finality settling in his chest. Number, you're wrong. We don't control the future. The future controls us. And it's time for that to end. As if on cue, the explosive device detonated. The shockwave ripped through the room, throwing Mark and Olivia to the floor. The machine exploded in a blinding flash of light, sending shards of metal and glass flying through the air. The room was filled with a deafening roar, and for a moment, everything seemed to stop. Time itself seemed to hesitate, caught in the violent aftermath of their actions. Then, the silence came. Mark lay on the floor, disoriented, his body aching from the blast. He blinked through the haze of dust and smoke, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Olivia was next to him, her face covered in dirt, but she was alive. They were alive. They had done it. They had destroyed the phone. They had destroyed the machine. And with it, they had destroyed the power to manipulate time. The remaining agents of the organization were scattered, stunned by the explosion, but none of them seemed to be in any condition to fight. The room was a wreck, the walls cracked and charred, the remnants of the machine smoldering in the center. The future, the control over it, had been wiped out in an instant. As the dust settled, Mark and Olivia stood up, their bodies sore but relieved. The battle was over. The phone, the machine, and everything associated with the twisted experiment had been destroyed. But what now? What would happen to the future? Had they truly undone the damage that had been done? Or had they simply shifted the course of events into an even more uncertain direction? For the first time in a long while, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he was no longer bound by the fear of it. He had faced the unknown and chosen to fight back, to stop the manipulation of time and fate. He had made his choice. Olivia looked at him, her expression softening. "You did it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We did it." Mark nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "We did." But even as the two of them stood amidst the ruins of the lab, the questions still lingered. What had the phone really shown them? What had been true, and what had been a product of the manipulation? Would the world ever be the same? The future was no longer set in stone, and Mark knew one thing for sure. It was up to them to shape it now. The world didn't end. It didn't collapse into chaos. But something had changed. Mark and Olivia had learned the hard way that the future wasn't something to be controlled. It was something to be lived. And as they walked away from the wreckage, they knew that the path ahead would be uncertain, full of challenges and choices. But for the first time in a long time, it was their future to decide. They had survived the storm, and now it was time to rebuild. Time wasn't something to fear anymore. It was something to embrace. and in the quiet aftermath, they knew one thing: the future was theirs.